The Chancellor had just called the final closure to order when the doors at the end of Concord Hall opened without permission, and 3 human beings walked in. Nobody had touched the release mechanism. The doors were 9 meters of fused stone glass, warded, alarmed, keyed to 12 levels of Concord clearance, and they swung inward on their own, silent, as though something on the other side had simply decided they would open, and the mechanism had agreed. Security along the aisle came up out of their seats. A chime that had not sounded in 400 years began pulsing red along the base of the dome. Chancellor Thal, presiding in the high seat with the closure writ already unsealed on the lectern in front of her, looked up from the words she had been about to read aloud, the words that would strike the last living entry for a species called Earth from every registry the Concord kept, and saw a young woman in a gray travel coat walking down the center aisle like she owned the floor. Soria Kell did not hurry. She had trained for 11 years not to hurry. 981 delegates, drawn from 41 member worlds, sat in tiered silence and watched 3 humans cross the marble floor of a chamber that had, 1,000 years to the standard day before this session, voted to let their species die. The final closure had been scheduled for a century. It was ceremonial. It was supposed to be brief, a formality closing a file that had been functionally empty since the Sundering Writ, 40 years after that, the earlier closure writ, and 9 intervening centuries of silence from a system nobody had bothered to keep watching. The archivists had prepared a single paragraph. The Chancellor had rehearsed reading it in a tone of appropriate solemnity. Nobody in the chamber, across 41 worlds and 981 seated delegates, had budgeted so much as 30 seconds for the possibility that the file might object. Soria reached the well of the chamber, stopped at the exact point where the floor mosaic changed from gray stone to black, and looked up at the Chancellor with an expression that held no fear at all. "You were about to close our registry," she said. "We'd like the record to reflect that we heard you start." For 3 full seconds, nobody in Concord Hall made a sound. Then the chamber came apart. It did not come apart the way Soria had trained for: no immediate shouting, no chaos she could use as cover, no easy read on a room. It came apart the way still water does when the first stone lands, a ripple, a widening silence before the noise. Delegates who had been half asleep through the drafting of a routine writ sat forward. A Verdin elder 3 tiers up made a sound Soria's linguistic implant flagged, unhelpfully, as asterisk distress vocalization, species unclassified in this context. Somewhere behind her, a full section of Halcrin delegates rose out of their seats in a single mottled gray wave, robes rustling like dry leaves, and did not sit back down. Security had reached the aisle by then, 4 corvée marshals in gray ceremonial plate, hands not yet on weapons but close, and it was the marshal in front, a broad-shouldered officer with a scarred crest running down the back of his elongated skull, who found his voice first. "Identify yourselves. This chamber is in closed session." "Soria Kell," she said, voice of the Ember Continuance. "This is Tomas Ilian, Continuance Registry." "This is Petra Aldrich, Continuance Honor Guard." She did not raise her voice to be heard over the chamber. She did not need to. The acoustics of Concord Hall had been built to carry a whisper to the highest tier, and every delegate in the building was leaning forward to catch what she said next. "We're here regarding an item on today's docket." "There is no such delegation registered," the marshal said. "There is no such polity in the Concord's index." "There wouldn't be," Soria said. "You wrote us out of it 960 years ago." Up in the high seat, Chancellor Thal had not moved. She was old even by Verdin standards, her blue scales gone the pale slate of late age along her jaw and throat, and she had presided over this chamber through 3 wars and 1 famine, and had not, in 31 years in the high seat, seen anything close to this. She set the closure writ down on the lectern with great and visible care. The The way a person sets down something that has suddenly become far more dangerous than they believed a moment ago. "Marshal Vec," she said, "stand your officers down from the aisle. Nobody draws a weapon in my chamber over a documentation dispute." Her eyes went back to Soria, and something in them, not fear, not yet, but the very beginning of a long-buried unease, sharpened. "You understand what you are claiming." "We understand exactly what we're claiming," Soria said. "Earth was declared extinct by unanimous vote of this body. There has been no verified contact with any human population in 961 years. The last recorded transmission from your species was a distress call that terminated mid-signal at the edge of the hollow reach, and no vessel, no probe, no listening post has recovered a single confirmed trace of a survivor since." The Chancellor's voice had found its floor register again, formal and dry. The voice of a presiding officer restating the record for the benefit of the chamber rather than the strange young woman in front of her. "You are aware of how many people, across how many worlds, have claimed descent from a lost species for the sake of asylum, of sympathy votes, of a conquered seat that comes with resource allocation attached. It happens perhaps once a decade. It is, without exception, a fraud, and it is, without exception, discovered within the hour." "Then discover it," Soria said. She reached into the satchel at her hip, slow, both hands visible, because she had rehearsed this moment on the crossing for 6 weeks, and knew exactly how fast 4 armed corvée marshals could close the distance if she moved wrong, and drew out a flat case the size of a hand, black metal, old in a way that nothing else in the chamber was old. It had scoring along one edge from something that had once tried very hard to open it and failed. "The hearth seal," she said, and set it on the black stone at the border of the well, precisely on the line where the floor changed color. "Continuity ledger, genetic archive, full voice record of the sundering vote pulled from a transmission your own conquered broadcast and that we happened to be listening to at the time. Verify it against your own 960-year-old copy if you kept one. We assume you did. Bureaucracies always keep one copy more than they admit to." A ripple of something moved through the tears at that. Not quite laughter, not from a chamber this rattled, but the ghost of it. The recognition of a joke landing in a room that badly needed the tension broken and did not know how to ask for it. The Chancellor did not smile. "Archivist Res," she said without turning her head, "retrieve it. Run full verification, live, on the chamber display, so that no one present can later claim the process was hidden from them." From a side gallery reserved for the conquered scholarly caste, a small, stooped figure rose, Ilvex, 4 black eyes set unevenly across a domed gray skull, robes so heavily layered they seemed to move a half-second behind their owner, and came down to the well with the unhurried gait of someone who had spent 4 centuries believing nothing could surprise him again. Archivist Ovan Res picked up the case, turned it over twice in long gray fingers, and looked at Soria with an expression she could not read at all. 961 years, he said, half to himself. The alloy shell is period correct. That at least is either genuine or an extraordinary forgery. He looked up at the Chancellor. 15 minutes presiding, perhaps 20. "Take it," the Chancellor said. "This chamber is not adjourning until we know what we're looking at." Soria did not sit down while they waited, though a bench had been produced for her at the edge of the well, an afterthought of courtesy from a chamber that did not yet know whether to treat her as a diplomat, a criminal, or a ghost. She stood instead, hands loosely clasped behind her back, and let 981 delegates from 41 worlds look at her for as long as they needed to. Beside her, Tomas Ilian, 19 years old, this is first crossing off the continuance's outer perimeter, the registry satchel still clutched against his chest like it might float away, was breathing too fast. She caught his eye once, gave him nothing more than the smallest shift of her chin, down and back up. "Steady." He straightened. It was the only instruction she gave anyone in that chamber for the first 20 minutes, and it was enough. 3 tiers up and to the left, in the section reserved for the Concord's oldest and wealthiest houses. A Halcyon delegate in robes far finer than the ceremonial gray of his neighbors had gone very still. His name, though Soria did not yet know it, was Proconsul Kessa Adran, and he was doing arithmetic that no one else in the chamber had thought to do yet. The arithmetic of exactly how many worlds, currently registered under his house's charter, had been surveyed, claimed, and settled under the terms of a 960-year-old writ that declared a particular species dead, and its systems open. He did not say anything. He did, very quietly, begin composing a message on the private terminal built into his armrest, and he sent it to 4 other delegates before the archivist had finished the first pass of verification. Nobody in Concord Hall noticed him do it. Soria, watching the room the way she had been trained to watch a room, noticed that he had gone still in a chamber where everyone else was in motion, and filed it away, and said nothing, because a young woman with no army standing alone in the well of a hostile institution does not spend her first 15 minutes chasing the one thread she cannot yet prove. She watched the doors instead. They had not fully closed since she walked through them. Beyond the threshold down the long processional hall, she could just make out a wash of daylight pouring through the outer atrium's glass, and past that, faint enough that she might have imagined it if she had not known exactly what she was looking for, a scatter of small dark shapes crossing high against the bright sky. Not yet, she thought. Not for hours yet, but they'll be there when it matters. Verification complete, Archivist Rest said, and the chamber went silent again, all 981 of them, in a way it had not managed to do even for the Chancellor. He turned to face the high seat, the black case open in his hands, 4 eyes moving across a readout only he could see. "The genetic archive is authentic," he said. "Continuous, unbroken lineage markers matching the pre-sundering human baseline on file in this Concord's own deep archive, which I would remind this body was sealed and witness-locked at the time of the original vote specifically so that it could never be quietly altered." He paused, and something moved behind those 4 black eyes that might, in an Ilvex, have been the equivalent of a held breath. "The voice record of the sundering vote is also authentic. Every seal matches. Every signature matches. Presiding, this is not the record I studied as a junior archivist 400 years ago. It is the same event. But it includes 41 minutes that our copy does not contain." The Chancellor's slate-pale jaw tightened by a degree. Soria doubted anyone, but Ress had been alive long enough to notice. "Play it," Soria said quietly, and for the first time since she had walked through the doors, her voice was not entirely steady. "You should hear what your predecessors said about us before they decided we weren't worth saving." Archivist Ress did not ask the Chancellor's permission a second time. He set the case into a floor receptacle Soria had not noticed until it rose to meet it, and the great holographic display that wrapped the upper curve of the dome, currently idling on a star chart of the Concord's core worlds, dissolved into a scene 961 years old. It was this same chamber. Fewer delegates then, the tiers less crowded, the architecture almost identical but for a bank of seats along the eastern wall that had since been removed. A different chancellor sat the high seat, a corvi with a crest not yet scarred, and the timestamp burning in the corner of the projection read, a date that made 3 separate delegates in the current session audibly inhale. "The Scarn advance has not slowed," the recorded chancellor was saying, mid-sentence, as though the recording had simply been cut into the middle of an argument that had been running for hours. "We have confirmed losses at 4 systems in the border arc. The human colonies at the edge of the hollow reach sit directly in the path of the next advance, and Earth's fleet, by their own admission, cannot hold that line alone." A voice from the tiers, translated by the ancient recording into flat Concord standard, cut across him. "Then the choice is not whether the border arc falls. The choice is whether it falls with our fleets committed to it or without them. You are proposing we abandon a member species to an existential threat. I am proposing we survive one." The recording ran on, and Soria had heard this transmission perhaps 400 times in her life. First as a child memorizing it the way other children memorized songs, then as a cadet made to transcribe it word for word, then as an adult who had chosen, against every instinct toward mercy, to bring the raw, unedited file into this chamber rather than a summary, and it never got easier to hear. Voice after voice, delegate after delegate, 41 minutes of a body debating, with scrupulous procedural care, whether it was worth the cost to save her species, and deciding in the end by a margin of 61 votes to 19 that it was not. "The sundering writ is passed," the old chancellor said at the end of it, and his voice in the recording was not cruel. That was, Soria had always thought, the worst part. It was tired. It was the voice of someone doing an arithmetic he did not enjoy and had convinced himself was necessary. Conquered forces will withdraw from all commitments along the Hollow Reach border effective immediately. The human systems are removed from conquered protection. This body extends its formal regret to the government of Earth and wishes its people every fortune the galaxy has left to offer them. The recording ended on the sound of a gavel, and then, after a pause of perhaps 4 seconds that the archive had preserved with brutal accuracy, on the sound of the old chancellor's own voice, quieter, off the formal record, speaking to an aide standing just off the projection's frame. "How long do you think they'll last?" "Not long, Chancellor." "No," the recording said. "I don't imagine they will." The display went dark. 981 delegates sat in Concord Hall in a silence that had a different weight to it now than it had held 20 minutes before. The difference between silence that does not yet understand and silence that has just been handed something it cannot put back down. Chancellor Eventhal sat very straight in the high seat, and when she spoke, her voice had lost the dry procedural register entirely. "That recording will be entered into the permanent record of this session," she said, "in full, unedited." She looked down at Soria, and for the first time something that might have been shame crossed a face built to be difficult to read. "I did not know the full content of that session. I was not born when it occurred. I inherited a summary, written by people who had every reason to write a kinder one than the truth." "Most people do," Soria said. "That's not an accusation. It's how archives work when nobody's checking them." "You survived it," the Chancellor said. "That is the part I confess I do not yet understand. The Hollow Reach was, by every survey this body has conducted in the intervening centuries, uninhabitable at any scale beyond a handful of hardened outposts. How does a species of, what was your population at the time of the sundering?" 6 billion across the homeworld and 11 colonies, Soria said. "We're not going to discuss current population figures in open session, Chancellor. I hope you'll understand why." That landed harder than the recording had. Soria watched it land, watched delegates who had spent the last 20 minutes recoiling from a 900-year-old cruelty suddenly reorient around a new and much more immediate fact. That whatever had happened to humanity in the Hollow Reach, it had not ended in extinction, and the woman standing calmly in the well of their chamber was not here to ask for pity. She was here informed, prepared, and the word arrived in more than one delegate's mind at once, though none of them said it aloud yet, armed with something none of them could yet see. Proconsul Kessa Adran rose from his seat. He was not a large delegate by Halcran standards, but he had the kind of stillness that made a room track him anyway. Robes the deep mottled green-gray of high house rank, mandibles working slowly beneath a face that had learned, over 4 centuries of conquered politics, to show exactly as much as he wanted shown and no more. "Presiding, if I may," he said, and the Chancellor inclined her head a fraction, granting the floor with visible reluctance. "This body has just witnessed something genuinely moving. A wrong done, a species presumed lost, a survivor's return. It is exactly the sort of moment this chamber ought to handle with care rather than haste." He turned, and for the first time addressed Soria directly, and his tone was courteous in a way that set every instinct she had trained into a low, quiet alarm. Envoy Kel, if that is indeed your name, you have presented a data seal of impressive authenticity. No one disputes the archivist's finding, but authenticity of an object is not the same as authenticity of a claim. Recording devices can be inherited. Recordings can be copied faithfully by people with no rightful claim to the history they depict. I ask, in the interest of this body's diligence rather than any doubt of your good faith, where, precisely, is this ember continuance you claim to speak for? What is its population? Its territory? Its fleet strength? A polity that wishes to reclaim a conquered seat, and the protections attached to it must submit to verification beyond a single artifact and a well-rehearsed entrance. It was, Soria thought, a good speech, measured, reasonable sounding, entirely designed to do one thing: force her to either lie, stall, or hand this chamber a complete strategic accounting of a fleet she had spent her entire life being trained never to hand anyone without a very good reason. She had known someone would try this. She had not expected it to come this fast, or this smoothly, and that told her something about the man asking it that she filed away next to the private message she had watched him send 11 minutes earlier. "With respect, proconsul," she said, "the sundering writ removed our protections on the theory that a chamber vote could decide, from a distance, what a fleet we could no longer verify was capable of. I'd rather not make the same mistake twice from either side of the table. When this body is ready to discuss reinstatement in good faith, we'll discuss capability. Today we're discussing whether you finish erasing us from your registry while we're standing in front of you telling you not to." A sound moved through the chamber, not quite a laugh, but close enough that two delegates in the third tier actually did laugh briefly before catching themselves. Proconsul Audron's mandibles stilled. He did not sit down yet. "A fair answer," he said, in a voice that made it clear he did not think it was fair at all, for someone unwilling to be questioned. "I've answered every question you've asked," Soria said. "I've simply declined to hand a chamber that voted to abandon my species a complete inventory of what's left of it. If that reads as evasion to you, proconsul, I'd ask you to sit with why a straightforward request for basic safety looks like evasion from where you're standing." The Chancellor's hand came down flat on the lectern once, not hard, but enough to draw every eye back to the high seat. "Enough," she said. "Proconsul Audron, your point is noted and will be addressed through proper procedure, not through cross-examination of a claimant in open session before verification is complete. Envoy Kel," and here she paused, visibly deciding in real time whether to grant the title at all, and Soria watched her decide to grant it. "Your identity and your artifact have been verified to the archivist's satisfaction. What remains is the substance of your claim. I am adjourning the final closure, effective this moment, pending a full hearing on the reinstatement of Earth's registry standing. That hearing will begin." She checked the chamber clock mounted above the dome's eastern arch, "in 1 hour, to allow this body time to absorb what it has just seen. Marshal Vec, the envoy and her party are to be treated as diplomatic guests of this chamber, not detainees, effective immediately." "Chancellor," Audron said, "with respect, a 1-hour recess before the reinstatement of a conquered seat is my decision, proconsul, and it stands." The Chancellor's slate-blue eyes did not leave Soria's face. "This body has had 961 years to decide what it believes about the people of Earth. It can manage 1 more hour before it decides what to do about them." She struck the small ceremonial gavel once against its rest. Not a dismissal, Soria understood, but a formal marker. The sound of a chamber consciously choosing to stop pretending this was routine, and the recess began. The antechamber they were shown to had clearly not been used for anything but storage in recent memory. A corvée attendant apologized twice for the dust on the long stone table before Marshal Vec waved him out and shut the door himself. and for a moment the three of them stood in a room built for far more important guests than the Conquered had believed it was receiving that morning. Tomas set the registry satchel down on the table like it had grown heavier in the last hour, and let out a breath that shook only a little. "That went," he started, and didn't finish, because there wasn't a word that covered it. "That went the way it was always going to go," Soria said. "They didn't shoot us. They didn't laugh us out the door. That's better than the two outcomes I actually planned contingencies for." She looked at Petra, who had not said a single word since the doors, and who was standing by the window slit with the particular stillness of a soldier counting exits. "Anything." "Two marshals outside the door instead of the one they told us to expect," Petra said. "Not hostile posture, just watching closer than a diplomatic guest usually rates." She did not turn from the window, and there's a Halcrin aide who's walked past twice pretending to be lost. "Audron's house holds the deed to at least 6 systems that used to be ours," Soria said. "He's not pretending to be interested. He's confirming what he's about to lose." A knock came at the door before either of them could say more, 3 short raps, and it opened without waiting for an answer, which in a room full of the Conquered's careful procedural manners was its own small statement, to reveal Archivist Oven Ress, alone, 4 black eyes blinking in the dim light of the antechamber like he found even that faintly too bright. "I have perhaps 6 minutes before someone notices I've left the gallery," he said. "I would like to spend them usefully." "Come in," Soria said. "Say what you came to say." He did, closing the door behind him with the careful economy of a man who had spent 4 centuries learning exactly how much noise a door was permitted to make. "I verified your seal because it is my function to verify seals, and because the truth serves this Conquered whether it is convenient or not. I did not expect it to move me. I want you to know that it did, and I want you to know why, because I do not think anyone else in that chamber will tell you plainly." He folded his long gray hands in front of him. "I was a junior archivist the year the closure writ passed, the second vote, 40 years after the sundering, the one that declared you extinct rather than merely abandoned. I helped catalog the file. I remember thinking, even then, that we had performed a great deal of grief for a species whose actual fate no one in this building had bothered to confirm. It was easier to mourn you than to go and look. I have carried that unease for 921 years. I did not expect to be given the chance to set it down." "You're not the one who needs to apologize," Soria said. "No, but I am the one in this room capable of telling you plainly what you are walking into this afternoon, which the Chancellor's diplomacy will not permit her to say outright." Ress's 4 eyes moved, unhurried, between Soria, Tomas, and the door. "Proconsul Kessa Audron's house holds title to 11 former human systems, granted under the Closure Writ's redistribution clause. 6 are actively settled by Halcrin colonies, now 3 generations deep. A full reinstatement of Earth's registry, with territorial claims attached, would not merely embarrass his house. It would very likely bankrupt it, and displace something over 400,000 of his own people from worlds they now consider home. He has spent the last hour, I am quite certain, doing exactly the arithmetic you watched him do in the chamber, and he did not reach a number he liked." "We're not here for the systems," Soria said. "I'd have led with that if I thought anyone would believe it yet." "They won't, not from you. Grief and fear travel faster than reassurance in a chamber this size. This body has known that about itself for longer than your species has existed, Envoy, and Audron has known it his entire career." Ress inclined his domed head slightly. "He will not attack your data. He cannot. I have already ruined that path for him, and he is not foolish enough to try to discredit my verification in open session. He will attack the frame around it. Watch for an argument that does not deny what you are, but questions what you might have become in 961 years of contact with things this Conquered has never surveyed. The Hollow Reach borders 3 unclaimed regions this body has never mapped. It would take very little imagination to suggest that Whatever came back through those doors this morning may not have come back alone, or unchanged, or friendly. Soria felt something in her chest go very cold and very still, the particular stillness she had trained for since she was 14 years old, and her father had first shown her the sundering recording in full. "He's going to call us infiltrators. I believe he is going to call you uncertain Ress said, which in a body this frightened of an enemy it has not defeated in 961 years amounts to the same accusation with better manners." He straightened, and for a moment something almost apologetic crossed his ancient gray face. "I have said more than my function permits. I will say one thing further, and then I will return to the gallery before I am missed. The sundering writ was not this body's proudest hour, but it was not passed by monsters. It was passed by frightened people who convinced themselves that abandoning you was survival rather than cowardice, because the alternative was admitting they had chosen cowardice with their eyes open. This body has spent 9 centuries being ashamed of what it did and calling that shame a memorial service. It does not yet know how to be confronted by what it did. Be patient with its fear a little longer than you want to be. It will cost you less than losing your composure will." He left before Soria could answer him, the door closing behind him with the same careful quiet it had opened with. And for a moment the antechamber held nothing but the sound of Tomas breathing, and, faint through the stone, the ordinary distant hum of a building full of people arguing about them. "He's not wrong," Petra said finally, still at the window, "about the fear." "He's not wrong about any of it," Soria said. She sat down at last, at the edge of the long dusty table, and let herself, for exactly as long as it took to draw one full breath, feel the whole 961 years of it at once. The recording, the old chancellor's tired voice. "How long do you think they'll last?" The 6 weeks of crossing in the dark with the long hearth's engines running quieter than they were rated to run because Warden Rowe had insisted, all the way out, that they arrive at this door and not be heard coming until they chose to be. Then she let the breath out and put it away, because there would be time for the weight of it later on the other side of whatever the next hour held, and none at all if she let it show on her face in front of people deciding, right now, whether her species deserved to keep existing on paper. "They're going to try to frighten this room into thinking we might be dangerous," she said. "So we're going to have to be very, very boring about it." Tomas gave a short, startled laugh, the first real sound of relief he'd made since the doors opened. "Boring. Calm reads as boring to a frightened room, and boring reads as safe," Soria said. "It's the least glamorous weapon we've got, and it's worked for us for 1,000 years. We're not going to stop using it now because someone finally noticed us using it." She looked at the door, and beyond it in her mind, the long processional hall and the atrium glass, and the sky she had not been able to stop herself checking on the way in. "How long until the hearing reconvenes?" 40 minutes, Petra said. "Then we use them," Soria said, "the way we've used every hour of the last 961 years. Quietly and on purpose." Outside, unseen by anyone in the antechamber, Proconsul Kessa Adran stood in a service corridor 2 floors below Concord Hall with 4 other delegates gathered close around him, and laid out, in a voice pitched too low for even Halcrin hearing to carry past the nearest wall, exactly the argument Owen Ress had already predicted word for word. The hearing reconvened with the tears fuller than they had been that morning. Word had moved through the building the way it always did in institutions built on centuries of gossip disguised as diplomacy, and delegates who had sent aides in their place for the routine final closure had returned in person, filling seats that had stood empty an hour before. 981 had become closer to 1100. Somewhere above the dome, Soria knew without being able to see it, the fleet was still 4 hours out, holding position exactly where Warden Rowe had told her it would. Chancellor Even Thal called the session to order with visibly less ceremony than she had used that morning. As though the pretense of routine had been a luxury, the chamber could no longer afford to perform. This body reconvenes to consider the reinstatement of Earth's conquered registry, suspended 961 years ago under the Sundering Writ, and formally closed 40 years later under the Closure Writ, both instruments now under review in light of verified evidence presented this morning. She looked out over the tiers with the flat patience of someone who had already guessed exactly what was coming. The floor is open. Proconsul Kessa Adrun rose before the Chancellor had finished the sentence. Presiding, I move that this body table the reinstatement question, pending a full security review of the claimant delegation. On what grounds, Proconsul? It was not a question. The Chancellor's voice had gone flat in a way that told Soria she had, in fact, guessed exactly what was coming and disapproved of it in advance. On the grounds that this body has not asked, in the understandable emotion of this morning's revelation, the one question that matters most for its own safety. Adrun turned, slow and deliberate, to face the well of the chamber, and Soria watched him choose, with visible care, an expression of grave and reluctant concern rather than triumph. The hollow reach borders 3 regions this conquered has never surveyed. 961 years is not a span in which a species merely survives. It is a span in which a species is shaped by hardship, by contact, by whatever forces occupy the dark on the far side of a border. We willingly stopped watching. We do not know what Earth has encountered out there. We do not know what Earth has become. And we do not know, I say this with no pleasure, presiding, only with the caution this body owes itself after the last enemy it failed to see coming cost 4 systems and 11,000 lives before anyone believed the warnings, whether everything standing in the well of this chamber is entirely what it claims to be. The word he did not say hung in the air anyway. Skarn, Soria heard 3 separate gasps ripple up through the tiers, and beside her she felt Tomas go rigid. You're suggesting, the Chancellor said, in a voice that had gone dangerously quiet, that this envoy may be an agent of the Skarn ascendancy. I am suggesting nothing, presiding. I am asking that this body confirm, through appropriate and painless verification, that it is not. Adrun spread his hands, the picture of reasonable restraint. If the envoy's claim is true, and I have no wish to see it otherwise, whatever anyone in this chamber may wish to believe about my motives, then a neutral biometric and cognitive scan will confirm it in minutes and cost her nothing but patience. If it is not true, this body will have avoided walking a threat that destroyed 4 of its systems directly into the center of a session, already unsealing a millennium of grief-softened defenses. I do not see what principle is served by refusing so small a request. It was, Soria thought again, a genuinely good speech, better than the first one. It had found the exact seam where sympathy for her curdled into fear of her, and it had done it without a single provable lie. She stepped forward before the Chancellor could rule, because she had learned a long time ago, from Warden Rowe, from her mother before him, from 9 centuries of a species that had survived by never letting silence be filled by someone else's narration of what it meant, that the worst thing she could do here was let this argument happen about her instead of asterisk to her face. I'll take the scan, she said. The chamber's noise, which had been building toward the kind of low roar Soria recognized as a room one push away from losing its procedural manners entirely, dropped by half. Adrun's mandibles stilled. Whatever response he had prepared, it had not been immediate agreement. I'll take it now in open session, on the chamber's own equipment, administered by whoever this body trusts most to be impartial, Soria said. Archivist Ress, if the chamber's willing. Not because the proconsul's suggestion is fair, it isn't, and every delegate old enough to remember why this species left in the first place should understand exactly what it costs us to stand in this well and be asked again, to prove we're not a threat before we're allowed to exist on your books. But because refusing would cost us the hearing, and the hearing matters more than my pride does. She looked at Adran directly for the first time since he'd risen, and let just enough of what she actually thought of him show in her face to be unmistakable without being actionable. I'd ask only that this body remember, when the scan comes back clean, exactly whose idea it was to make me stand here and submit to it, and exactly what that idea was actually protecting. A long beat of silence, and then, from the third tier, one of the two delegates who had laughed earlier that morning said, quite clearly, in a voice not meant to carry but carrying anyway in the dome's honest acoustics, "That's the woman he's worried might be dangerous." The chamber's mood broke, not into laughter this time but into something closer to shame, a physical shift of 1,100 bodies away from Adran's careful framing and toward something that looked, for the first time that day, like sympathy without condition attached. Soria did not let herself feel the relief of it yet. She had learned that too, a long time ago, that a room's mood could turn twice more before it mattered, and that the only safe moment to feel relieved was after the vote, not before it. Archivist Rest descended to the well a second time, and this time he brought with him a Concord scanning frame, standard equipment, the kind used at every border checkpoint in the 41-member worlds, and Soria stood inside its pale blue field for the 90 seconds it took to render its verdict with the same composed stillness she had held since the doors first opened. Subject, human, baseline genetic and neurological profile. No foreign cognitive architecture detected. No signature consistent with Scarn bioengineering, symbiotic integration, or known infiltration methodology on file. Confidence, 99.97%. The number hung in the air above the well, projected large enough for the highest tier to read. Satisfied, proconsul? The Chancellor asked, and there was an edge in it now that had not been there that morning, the edge of a presiding officer who had watched a member of her own body attempt something ugly and dress it as caution. "I am relieved, presiding," Adran said, and had the discipline not to let anything else show. "As I said, I had no wish to see the claim proven false." "Then this body will proceed," the Chancellor said, "to the substance of the reinstatement question, and this body will further note, for the permanent record, that the motion which delayed us by 20 minutes produced exactly the result any reasonable observer might have predicted, at a cost paid entirely by the party least responsible for this chamber's fear." She looked down at Soria, and something in her ancient blue-scaled face had shifted since the morning, some calculation quietly settling into place. "Envoy Kell, I will ask you directly, since indirection has served this session poorly today, what is it precisely that the Ember Continuance is asking of this body?" Soria had rehearsed this answer for 6 weeks. She had cut it down 4 times, each time shorter than the last, because Warden Rowe had told her, the night before the shuttle launched, that the whole of their case would live or die on whether she could say the true thing in 1 breath instead of 10. "Recognition," she said, "that Earth exists, that it never stopped existing, whatever this body wrote down about it, that the file closes today but not the way you scheduled it to." The Chancellor studied her for a long moment, and behind her, high above the dome, though no one in Concord Hall could see it yet, the first faint dark shapes had begun to resolve against the bright daytime sky, still hours out, still holding their patient formation, exactly where they had been told to wait. "Recognition is a word, Envoy," said a Corvi delegate from the second tier, not Adran's ally, Soria judged, watching the careful neutrality of her posture but not yet a friend either. "This body does not restore conquered seats to words. It restores them to polities, governed, bounded, accountable. What governs the Ember Continuance? What territory does it hold? What does reinstatement actually obligate this chamber to recognize?" "A fair question," Soria said, "and one I can answer without handing this chamber a targeting solution." She let the small joke sit for exactly as long as it took 2 more delegates to allow themselves a tight, unwilling smile. "The continuance is governed by a council of wardens, 7 seats, elected by settlement block every 12 years. I don't hold a warden seat myself. I was sent because I speak Concord standard cleanly, and because I'm expendable in a way the council judged the wardens themselves are not. And I'd ask this body not to read anything sinister into that. It's just arithmetic. We have 11 confirmed settlements across 4 systems within what your charts still call the hollow reach, plus outposts I'm not authorized to enumerate today. Population in the aggregate is in excess of 40 million. The number moved through the chamber like a physical thing. 40 million was not the population of a remnant, a handful of desperate survivors clinging to a wrecked colony ship. 40 million was the population of a functioning civilization, built in secret, over centuries, inside a border region the conquered itself had surveyed as uninhabitable and then simply stopped looking at. 40 million, the Chancellor repeated, very quietly, and Soria watched the number do something to her that the recording and the hearth seal together had not quite managed. Turn the abstraction of a species presumed dead into the concrete, uncomfortable fact of a civilization the conquered had failed to notice growing for 9 centuries in its own backyard. How? Adran said, and this time there was no careful concern in his voice at all, only the flat disbelief of a man watching his arithmetic get worse in real time. Forgive me, envoy, but the hollow reach was surveyed at scale as recently as 300 years ago. Conquered long-range sensors covered that entire border arc during the 3rd expansion. 40 million people, 4 systems, do not simply escape detection by an instrument array built to find exactly that. They do, Soria said, if the people being looked for know exactly what that instrument array is looking for, and have 300 years to make sure it never finds it. She did not elaborate further, and this time she let the silence do the work rather than filling it, because some things, the listening posts hidden in cometary debris fields, the deliberately dim engine signatures, the deep patience of a species that had learned the hardest way possible that being found meant being erased, were not owed to a chamber that had not yet finished deciding whether it regretted trying to erase them in the first place. Delegate Yethsur rose from the 4th tier, a Corvi Soria had not yet heard speak, older than the marshal at the aisle, with the deliberate, unhurried cadence of someone who had outlasted several political fashions in this chamber and trusted none of them completely. Presiding, I would put a practical question to the envoy, since the proconsul's diligence has at least established the right category of concern, even if I question his motive for raising it. If this body verifies independently, through its own instruments rather than the envoy's testimony alone, that a settlement exists at coordinates she is willing to provide, would the Ember continuance permit a single unarmed conquered scout vessel to confirm it? Not a fleet, not an inspection force. One vessel, transponder broadcasting, escorted by nothing, verifying nothing but the plain fact that people are there and are not, on first contact, hostile. Soria considered it for exactly as long as it took to be seen considering it, because a decision made too fast would look like it had been planned in advance, which it had, weeks ago, aboard the Long Hearth, in exactly this contingency, and a decision made too slow would look like fear. One outpost, she said, not a core settlement. Coordinates I'll provide personally to the archivist, sealed until the vessel launches, so that no one in this chamber can claim afterward that the location was staged for the visit. She looked at Yethsur and allowed something almost like respect to enter her voice. The people there will not be expecting company. They'll be exactly what they are on an ordinary day, which is the only kind of proof that actually means anything. Then let it be so ordered, the Chancellor said, and there was, for the first time since the doors had opened that morning, something in her voice that was not quite hope but stood close enough beside it to be mistaken for it at a distance. Marshal Vec, dispatch the fastest scout in the yard. Archivist Ress, take the sealed coordinates from the envoy personally and hold them until the vessel is in transit. This body will recess a second time to await its report, and I will remind every delegate in this chamber that the last time we rushed a judgment about the people of Earth, it took us 961 years and a room full of ghosts to admit we had been wrong. The recess this time was longer, the scouts' transit and return timed, by Ress's careful estimate, at just under 3 hours, and Soria spent the first of them in the antechamber not resting but working, laying out with Tomas the exact language of the reinstatement terms she intended to put before the chamber once the vote came, terms that had been drafted and redrafted across 6 weeks of crossing, and that she had no intention of improvising in front of 1,100 delegates. It was in the second hour that Petra, still stationed at the window, said, without turning, "Someone's coming, and it isn't a marshal." The knock, when it came, was hesitant in a way none of the day's other visitors had been, not the confident three-rap announcement of an archivist secure in his own authority, but something smaller, quicker, almost apologetic. When Soria opened the door herself, she found a young Halcrin aide standing in the corridor, robes plain rather than house-marked, mandibles working nervously, casting glances back over her shoulder toward the stairwell as though counting the seconds before someone noticed she was gone. "I serve in Proconsul Adran's office," the aide said before Soria could ask. "I am not here on his authority. I want that understood before I say anything else." "Understood," Soria said. "Come in." The aide did not come in. She stayed in the doorway, as though crossing the threshold would make whatever she was about to do irreversible in a way that speaking from the hall would not. The proconsul has spent the last hour drafting correspondence to 5 other house heads, proposing a joint motion to reject reinstatement outright regardless of the scouts' findings, on the grounds that conquered stability outweighs, his words, sentiment for the dead. I have copied the correspondence. She held out a small data chit, her hand not quite steady. "I am telling you this because my grandmother settled one of the 11 systems his house now holds, and she used to tell me, when I was small, that the empty world we lived on had a name once, before it was ours, and that no one had ever explained to her satisfaction what had happened to the people who used to call it that. I did not understand what she meant until this morning." The aide set the chit on the small table just inside the door, careful not to let her hand cross fully into the room. "I have to go before I'm missed. I would ask that whatever you do with this, my name not appear in it." She was gone before Soria could thank her, footsteps quick and light down the corridor, and Petra retrieved the chit from the table and turned it over once in her fingers without touching its contents. "Well," Petra said, "that's not nothing." "No," Soria said, looking at the closed door, thinking of a grandmother on a world that used to have a different name, of a small act of conscience that had cost a young woman with no power at all everything she had to risk. "That's not nothing at all." The attempt Petra had warned of came 20 minutes before the recess ended, and it came exactly the way Petra had told Soria it would, not as a raid, not as anything a report could later call an incident, but as 2 Corvai marshals arriving at the modest shuttle bay, assigned to the continuance's landing craft with a printed inspection order, and the bland, procedural courtesy of officers who had clearly been told the paperwork would hold up to scrutiny. "Routine compliance check," the senior of the 2 said, holding the order out for Petra to examine. "Standard for any vessel docked inside conquered jurisdiction longer than 6 hours. We'll need access to the cargo hold and the flight recorder." Petra took the order, read it once, and did not hand it back. "This bay was assigned to us under diplomatic guest status an hour ago, by the Chancellor's own order," she said. "Diplomatic vessels are exempt from routine compliance inspection under Concord Charter, Section 11, unless the request is countersigned by the presiding officer of an open session. I don't see the Chancellor's signature on this. I see a Halcrin requisition stamp I don't recognize, routed through a facilities office that has no standing to authorize a search of a diplomatic craft." The marshal's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to realize she was right, and Soria, arriving at the bay entrance with Tomas a step behind her, drawn there by a calm alert from Petra that had used exactly 3 words. *shuttle now, quiet. Watched the exact moment the man's certainty cracked into something closer to embarrassment. The order came through proper channels, he said, less certainly now. We were told. I don't doubt you were told something, Petra said, not unkindly. I'd ask you to confirm it with the Chancellor's office directly before either of you sets foot past this line. Because if you don't, and this bay's status gets raised in open session this afternoon, which it will, because I intend to raise it myself, the only name that ends up attached to an unauthorized search of a diplomatic vessel on the first day of a reinstatement hearing is going to be yours, not whoever handed you that stamp. The 2 marshals withdrew without further argument, the senior one already reaching for his own comm to make the confirming call Petra had suggested, and Soria let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Adran, she said, it wasn't a question. Or someone doing his errands while his own hands stayed clean enough to survive a censure hearing, Petra said. Either way, they were fishing. Flight recorder would have given them our approach vector, which would have given them a rough fix on the Long Hearth staging position, which is exactly the kind of thing a man trying to prove we're secretly dangerous would very much like to have in his pocket before this afternoon session. She handed the printed order to Tomas. Copy that, all of it. Timestamp, requisition number, the works. If Adran's people try this again, I want the paper trail sitting in the record before they finish drafting the next attempt. You think they will try again, Soria said. I think a man who's already decided the outcome doesn't matter isn't going to stop testing the walls just because the first push didn't work, Petra said. That's not a guess, Envoy. That's just what cornered people do. We should know. We spent 900 years being the ones doing the testing. She looked toward the bay's open doors, toward the bright afternoon light beyond them, and something in her flat, professional calm allowed, for just a moment, a harder edge to show through. Difference is, we did our testing quietly from a distance, for as long as it took to be sure. He's doing his in the open badly because he's out of time and doesn't have anything else left to try. That should tell you which one of us this Concord actually needs to worry about. The chamber reconvened for the 3rd time with a different texture to its noise entirely. Not the shocked hush of the morning, not the sharpened tension of the scan, but something closer to anticipation, the particular restlessness of a room that suspected it was about to have its remaining assumptions taken apart one at a time, and had, against its own expectations, begun to want to see it happen. Marshal Vec delivered the scout's report himself, standing at the base of the well with a formality that suggested even a career security officer understood he was about to say something that would outlast his career. The vessel reached the sealed coordinates 4 minutes ago and has been transmitting continuously since. He looked up at the Chancellor. Presiding, I recommend the chamber view the feed directly rather than hear it summarized. The dome's display resolved into a live feed, slightly grainy with the compression of long-range transmission, and showed what the Concord Scout's sensors were seeing in real time. A system with 2 settled worlds and a scattered ring of habitats around a gas giant's largest moon, orderly agricultural terracing on the inner world's temperate belt, a modest but unmistakably organized orbital shipyard with 3 vessels under construction, and the detail that made even the Chancellor go still, children. A schoolyard, visible from orbit through a wide clearing between 2 low buildings, dozens of small figures at what was unmistakably recess, scattering and regrouping in the ordinary chaos of any planet's midday. Nobody had expected children. Soria watched that land across the chamber more heavily than the population figure had, more heavily than the shipyard, more heavily than anything else that day. The plain, undignified, undeniable fact of a schoolyard, proof that whatever had happened to Earth in the Hollow Reach, it had not merely survived. It had kept living long enough to raise a next generation who had never known anything but this life, on a world that used to belong, on paper, to someone else's house. A voice crackled through on the open channel, not urgent, not alarmed. a settlement administrator's flat working tone answering a hail that had clearly startled her without frightening her. "This is Outer Terrace, unidentified vessel, please confirm registry and intent. You are inside our approach corridor." A pause, and then when the scout's transponder resolved as conquered issue, something changed in the voice, not fear. Something closer to disbelief held very carefully in check. "Conquered registry. That hasn't happened in my lifetime. Please hold position. I need to raise the warden's office before I say anything else. And please, whatever you do, don't look like you're in a hurry. We've got children outside." The feed cut there, at Ress's own request, the archivist quietly noting to the Chancellor that further transmission belonged to the settlement's own discretion, not the Concord's curiosity, and the dome returned to the ordinary star chart, idle it had shown that morning before any of this began. For a long moment, nobody spoke. 40 million, the Chancellor said finally, was a number. That was not a number. Soria said nothing. She had learned, across the long weeks of preparing for this exact moment, that there was no version of her adding anything to that silence that would serve her species better than simply letting the chamber sit inside it. It was Adran who broke the silence, and Soria watched him do it with something that was not quite surprise, because Oven Ress had told her, hours ago, exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. And this was precisely the move a man like that would make when the ground had shifted under him faster than he could recalculate. "A charming settlement," he said, rising, and his voice had regained its earlier smoothness, though something underneath it had gone thin and taut in a way it had not been that morning. "Genuinely, I do not dispute what we have all just seen. But I would ask this chamber to consider what an orbital shipyard, 3 vessels under construction, represents in a system this body has just been told is one of merely 11. A modest agricultural outpost with active warship production is not, forgive me, the picture of a peaceful people quietly rebuilding. It is the picture of a civilization arming itself. And I would ask again, as I asked this morning, whether this body has fully reckoned with what 40 million people and an active shipyard, multiplied across 4 systems, and however many unnamed outposts the envoy has declined to enumerate, might actually represent to this Concord's long-term security. "Their transports proconsul," Soria said, before the Chancellor could rule on the floor. "Freight haulers. Outer Terrace resupplies 2 other outposts, and the shipyard at the Long Hearth's home system does the heavy work. We don't build warships at agricultural outposts for the same reason you don't station your battle fleet in a farming town. I'd have thought a man this concerned with our fleet strength would have done slightly better reconnaissance before guessing at it out loud in open session." The chamber's mood, already tilted hard away from him, tipped further, and this time the sound that moved through the tears was unmistakably, openly amused, not cruel, but unwilling to pretend any longer, and Soria watched 2 of the 4 delegates Adran had gathered in that service corridor lean visibly away from him in their seats, putting distance between themselves and a man whose careful arithmetic had just been shown, in front of everyone, to be sloppy as well as self-serving. "Presiding," Soria said, and her voice changed register slightly, dropping the sparring tone entirely. "I'd like to enter something into the record, and I'd like the chamber to understand I did not come here today intending to use it. I was given it 2 hours ago by someone in this building, who has more courage than this body has any right to expect from someone with as little power as she has." She set the data chit on the black stone at the border of the well, exactly where the hearth seal had rested that morning, and watched Adran's mandibles go very, very still. "Archivist Ress can verify its authenticity the same way he verified mine," she said. "I'd ask him to do it now, in open session, so no one can later claim it was doctored on the way here." The Chancellor's eyes went from the chit to Adran's face and back, and something in her expression, old, patient, 31 years accustomed to reading exactly this species of guilt across a chamber floor, settled into a kind of grim certainty even before Ress had crossed the well a third time. "Proceed," she said. Ress took perhaps 90 seconds this time, the chit's contents already largely legible on his handheld reader before he had finished crossing the floor, and when he looked up, his 4 black eyes found Audron's face, and held there with an expression that 4 centuries of professional neutrality could not fully smooth away. "The correspondence is authentic," he said. 5 letters drafted within the last 90 minutes, addressed to house heads Vren Castle, Orsa Denth, Haven Yud, Sierra Molt, and Pharaoh Halkin. Each proposes a joint motion to reject Earth's reinstatement, regardless of verification outcome, on the stated grounds that I will read this exactly as written, presiding, because I do not believe I could improve on its clarity by paraphrasing. This conquered stability is better served by a settled distribution of the hollow reach systems under existing charter than by sentiment for the dead, however movingly staged. He lowered the reader. The letters are dated and signed with the proconsul's own seal. There is no ambiguity in their authorship. The chamber did not erupt. Soria had half expected it to, had braced for the kind of noisy collapse into shouting that would have felt, in a strange way, easier to navigate than what actually happened, which was a long, cold, total silence, 1,100 delegates absorbing the fact that a member of their own body had spent the morning performing grave concern for conquered security in open session, while privately drafting a plan to reject the truth regardless of what it turned out to be. Chancellor Eventhal's slate-blue face, when Soria looked up at the high seat, had gone hard in a way it had not managed even during the sundering recording. "Proconsul Audron," she said, "you stood in this well not 2 hours ago and told this body you had no wish to see the claim proven false. Do you wish to revise that statement now, in light of correspondence bearing your own seal that says the opposite in your own words?" Audron did not sit down, and Soria gave him that much credit even as she watched whatever composure he had left drain visibly out of his posture. "Presiding, my house's holdings are a matter of legitimate concern to 400,000 of my own people, who have made their homes on those worlds in good faith for 3 generations, believing, as this conquered itself declared, that no rightful claimant remained. I do not apologize for defending them." "You do not apologize," the Chancellor said, "for lying to this chamber's face in open session while working, in private, to guarantee a predetermined outcome regardless of the evidence this body was sworn to weigh honestly. Those are not the same failure, proconsul, and I would ask you not to conflate them for the sake of your own dignity at this late hour." She let the silence sit for a moment before she went on, and when she did, her voice had the flat finality of a woman closing a door she had been reluctant, until just now, to close all the way. "This body will address the question of your house's standing, and your own, through the proper censure procedure, at a separate session, where the concerns of 400,000 settlers who bear no responsibility for your conduct will be heard with the seriousness they deserve regardless of what this hearing decides. You will not speak again on the reinstatement question today. Be seated." He sat. Soria watched him do it, watched the last of the careful, reasonable-sounding statesman fall away from his posture all at once, leaving behind something smaller and more tired, and felt, unexpectedly, not triumph but something closer to the flat exhaustion of a fight that had gone on 961 years too long already. "Presiding," Yethsur said, rising again into the space Audron's silence had left, "I would move that this body proceed to a vote on the substantive question before us, without further delay, out of respect for the hour this session has already cost the envoy and her party, and out of respect, frankly, for our own dignity, which has been tested enough for one day." "Seconded," said the Corvi delegate from the second tier who had asked the first hard question, hours ago, about what governed the Ember continuance, and Soria noted, filing it away, that it was precisely the delegates who had questioned her hardest and fairest who now moved fastest to close the matter, which told her something true about the difference between honest scrutiny and Audron's manufactured kind. "The motion carries without objection," the Chancellor said. "This body will vote on the reinstatement of Earth's conquered registry, in full standing, effective immediately upon passage, with territorial questions regarding the 11 systems under the closure writs redistribution, referred to a separate commission for equitable resolution, rather than decided by this vote alone." She looked down at Soria one last time before the vote opened, and something passed between them that was not quite warmth but stood adjacent to it. The recognition of two people who had each, in their own register, spent the day doing something difficult correctly. "Envoy Kell, is there anything further your delegation wishes entered into the record before this body votes?" Soria opened her mouth to say there was not. The terms were drafted. The case was made. There was nothing left to add that would not simply be her filling silence for its own sake, exactly the mistake she had spent all day refusing to make, when the great chime along the base of the dome sounded a second time. It was not the alarm that had greeted their arrival that morning. It was a different tone entirely, one Soria recognized instantly, because Marshal Vek's face recognized it a half-second before hers did, going from grim satisfaction at Audron's collapse to something far more urgent in the space of a single breath. "Presiding," Vek said, already moving toward the tactical display at the base of the well, "long-range sensors are reporting a mass contact entering the system. Multiple vessels." "Confirmed," he paused, reading a readout that was clearly updating faster than he could speak it aloud. "Confirmed dozens of vessels. Presiding, holding formation at the system's outer marker. Transponders broadcasting an identification code this array has never logged before." Every eye in Concord Hall, all 1,100 of them, went first to the tactical display, and then, as one, to the vast glass dome overhead, where the bright daytime sky that had poured warm, undisturbed light down into the chamber all day long had begun, faint and high and unmistakable, to fill with the small dark shapes of an arriving fleet. For the second time that day, Concord Hall came apart, and this time it came apart the way Soria had actually trained for. The noise was immediate and total, 1,100 delegates coming up out of their seats at once, marshals along every aisle drawing sidearms that had stayed holstered even through the accusation of infiltration. A rising wall of overlapping voices in 41 languages that the chamber's translation systems could not resolve fast enough to keep pace with. Somewhere in the tiers, a Halkran elder's voice rose clear above the rest, sharp with something that was not quite panic but stood very close beside it. "How many? Vek, how many vessels?" 61 confirmed, presiding, more resolving at the edge of sensor range, Marshal Vek said, and to his considerable credit his own voice did not break even as the number climbed. "Formation is defensive." "Repeat, formation is defensive. The vessels are holding at the outer marker in a standard picket pattern, not advancing, not powering weapons. Transponders are broadcasting continuous open-frequency identification. No hostile signature, no weapons lock on any conquered asset in system." Chancellor Eventhal had risen from the high seat, one hand gripping the edge of the lectern, and for the first time all day, Soria watched genuine fear move across the old Verdant's face. Not fear of Soria, not anymore, but the older, deeper, more honest fear of a presiding officer watching a threat she could not yet fully assess arrive over her own chamber in real time. "Envoy Kell," the Chancellor said, and her voice had gone tight and formal in the way voices go when the person speaking is holding themselves very carefully together. "What is that?" Soria did not move from where she stood in the well. She had known this moment was coming for 6 weeks, had rehearsed exactly how still to hold her body when it arrived, and she held it now with everything she had, because 1,100 delegates were about to decide, in the next 30 seconds, based entirely on what they saw in her face, whether the fleet above them meant war or the opposite of it. That's the Ember Line, she said. 61 vessels of the Continuance's home fleet, holding position at the outer marker exactly where they were ordered to hold 6 hours ago, when my shuttle broke atmosphere for this chamber. She let that land before she went on. They're not here because this hearing went badly, Chancellor. They're here because Warden Rowe gave the order before I ever walked through your doors this morning, on a timer that had nothing to do with anything said in this room today. We knew when the final closure was scheduled. We've known your calendar for longer than you'd be comfortable hearing about. The fleet's arrival was set the day I launched, regardless of outcome, because whatever this body decided today, we intended to be seen either way. Quietly, if you'd heard us fairly and reinstated the registry without incident. Impossible to ignore if you hadn't. You brought a war fleet to a diplomatic hearing, someone shouted from the upper tiers, and this time the chamber's noise surged again, sharp and afraid. I brought 61 ships that have held picket formation, weapons cold, for the last 4 hours while your marshals ran a scan through my body, and your proconsul accused me of being an enemy agent in open session, Soria said. And for the first time all day, something in her voice sharpened past composure into something closer to the flat, controlled edge of genuine anger, carefully rationed and immediately reined back in. If the Ember Continuance wanted this conquered frightened Chancellor, we would not have spent 6 hours holding still at your outer marker while you decided whether to believe a data seal. We'd have simply arrived. The fact that we didn't, the fact that they're still sitting exactly where they were told to sit, transponders broadcasting, weapons cold, while 1,100 of you decide what to do about a woman standing alone in an empty well. That is the message, Chancellor. Not the ships. The waiting. The chamber did not go quiet all at once. It took a long moment, ripples of the argument continuing in scattered pockets of the tiers, even as the center of the room began to still. But it did still, gradually, delegate by delegate, as the tactical display continued to confirm over and over, in cold, unemotional readouts, exactly what Soria had said. 61 vessels, formation unchanged, weapons cold, no advance, no threat, no movement at all beyond the patient act of being visible. It was Archivist Owen Ress, still standing near the well from his last verification, who spoke into the settling silence, his voice quiet but carrying with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 4 centuries learning exactly how to be heard without raising his voice. Presiding, he said, I would remind this body of something it has perhaps lost sight of in the last several minutes. 961 years ago, this chamber voted to abandon a species to an existential threat rather than pay the cost of defending them. That species has just demonstrated, in the clearest terms available to it, that it could have made this conquered pay any cost it chose today, and chose instead to sit still and wait for a hearing. He turned slowly to take in the full sweep of the tiers. I have spent my entire professional life studying the historical record of this conquered's failures. I do not know that I have ever seen restraint of this magnitude demonstrated by a party with this much power to abandon it. I would ask this body to notice that, before its fear finishes writing tonight's version of events for it. Chancellor Eventhal stood very still at the lectern for a long moment, her hand still gripping its edge, and when she finally spoke, her voice had steadied, though something in it remained changed for good. Marshal Vec, she said, maintain full alert status but stand down from any escalation posture. No conquered vessel fires without my direct order, and no conquered vessel approaches that formation without an explicit invitation from it. Her eyes came back down to Soria, and there was something in them now that had not been there even an hour before, not quite trust, not yet, but the visible, effortful decision to extend something like it. Envoy Kell. I am going to ask you one question, and I want the true answer, not the diplomatic one. If this body had voted against you today, if the final closure had been permitted to complete before you ever reached this well, what would that fleet have done? Soria held the Chancellor's gaze, and answered the way she had promised herself, 6 weeks ago aboard the Long Hearth, that she would answer this exact question if anyone in this chamber ever had the honesty to ask it directly. "Nothing," she said. "They'd have held the same formation for one more day, and then they'd have gone home, and we'd have gone back to the dark, and you'd never have known we were ever here at all. That's the part this chamber still hasn't understood, Chancellor. We didn't come back today because we needed you to say yes. We came back because we decided, after 961 years, that we were done letting a mistake this body made once stand as the last word on whether we existed. Your vote today doesn't decide whether Earth is real. It only decides whether this Concord's registry catches up to something that's been true the whole time." The chamber was silent again, but it was a different silence than any that had come before it that day. Not shock, not fear, not the held breath of a body deciding whether it was in danger, but something quieter and heavier, the particular silence of 1,100 people recognizing, all at once, that they had spent a morning being frightened of a mercy. Chancellor Eventhal struck the ceremonial gavel once, and this time the sound of it carried the full weight of 31 years in the high seat behind it. "This body will vote," she said, "on the reinstatement of Earth's Concord registry now." The vote was taken by block, as Concord procedure demanded for any matter touching territorial standing, and Soria stood in the well and listened to 41 delegations declare themselves one at a time, each voice landing in the wide silence of the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. The Verdun bloc voted first, by tradition, since the presiding chancellor's own species always opened a contested roll. "Affirm," said the bloc leader without elaboration, and the chancellor's slate-blue face did not change, though Soria thought she saw something ease, fractionally, in the set of her shoulders. The Ilvex bloc followed, Oven Ress's people, scholarly and slow to commit to anything without a century of study behind it, and Soria had genuinely not known which way they would fall until the bloc leader rose and said, simply, "This body has spent 961 years mourning a mistake it never had the courage to correct. Affirm, and let the correcting begin today rather than in another 961 years of speeches about it." The Halkrin bloc was the one Soria watched most closely, because it was Adran's own people, and because 400,000 settlers on former human worlds had every practical reason to want this vote to fail regardless of what their proconsul's private correspondence had cost him personally. The bloc leader, not Adran, who sat silent and stripped of the floor at the edge of his delegation's seats, but an older Halkrin matriarch Soria had not heard speak once all day, rose slowly, and took a long moment before she answered. "My house holds no former human territory," the matriarch said. "I have watched this session with the advantage of distance from what my colleague stands to lose. I will say only this. A people who could have ended today's hearing with 61 ships and chose, instead to end it with a woman standing alone in an empty well, are not a people this Concord can afford to have as enemies, and are not, I think, a people who deserve to have been treated as suspects for the crime of having survived what we left them to survive. Affirm." Block after block, the count climbed, and Soria kept her face still through all of it, the way she had kept it still through the recording and the scan and the accusation of infiltration, because she had promised herself, 6 weeks ago, that whatever this chamber decided, it would not see her flinch either way. But she felt it, standing there, felt the weight of 961 years bending, slowly, unmistakably, toward something her species had stopped letting itself hope for some time around the 3rd generation in the dark. When hope had become a luxury, the continuance's founders decided they could no longer afford to teach their children. The final tally, when Chancellor Eventhal read it aloud, was not close. 36 blocks affirmed, 3 abstained, 2, including, unsurprisingly, the 2 houses whose names Ress had read off Adran's correspondence and who had not yet had the political courage to distance themselves from him publicly, voted against. "The motion carries," the Chancellor said, and struck the gavel a final time. Effective immediately, the registry of Earth, and the standing of the Ember Continuance as its lawful successor polity, is reinstated in full to this Concord's roles. The sundering writ and the closure writ are both entered into permanent historical record as instruments this body regrets and does not intend to see repeated. Territorial questions regarding the 11 redistributed systems are referred, as agreed, to a standing commission, which will hear the concerns of settlers and claimants alike with equal seriousness. She looked down at Soria, and for the first time all day, allowed something that was unmistakably relief to cross her ancient face. Envoy Kel. On behalf of this body, belatedly, imperfectly, 961 years too late to spare your people the cost of our failure, welcome home. Soria had rehearsed a dozen responses to this exact moment across 6 weeks of crossing, had discarded most of them as either too soft or too sharp, and in the end, standing in the well with the vote still settling into the room around her, she found she did not need any of them. "Thank you, Chancellor," she said. "We'll take it from here." It was not a large statement. It was not meant to be. But something in the plainness of it, the flat, unadorned refusal to turn the moment into more than it needed to be, the same brevity that had carried her through the whole of that impossible day, moved through the chamber more than a speech would have. And Soria watched from the well, a room full of alien faces she had spent the morning bracing against soften, degree by degree, into something that looked, for the first time, almost like welcome. Above the dome, unseen but felt by everyone in the chamber, the 61 ships of the Ember Line held their formation a moment longer, and then, with no visible urgency, began a slow, unhurried realignment. Not a withdrawal, not an advance, simply a shift from picket posture into something looser, more settled, the body language of a fleet that had been braced for a fight and had just been told, through channels none of the delegates below could see, that it would not need to be. Marshal Vec, still monitoring the tactical display, allowed himself, for the first time in 6 hours, to holster his sidearm fully. "Presiding," he said, "the formation stood down from alert posture. They're just holding station now, like they're planning to stay a while." "They are," Soria said. "If this Concord will have us." The Chancellor's answer was not a word. It was a gesture, a small one, easy to miss if you were not watching for it. The incline of an old verdant head toward the empty seat that had, that morning, been marked for a species this body believed extinct, and that would, by evening, be reinscribed with a name that had not appeared on any Concord roll in 961 years. Earth. The formal recognition of Earth's registry generated 40 minutes of the kind of ceremonial procedure that Concord Hall clearly loved, and Soria endured with as much patience as she could manage. A formal seating of the reinstated delegation's chair, a reading of the amended rolls, a brief and visibly uncomfortable statement from the 2 houses that had voted against reinstatement, walking back the substance of their objection while preserving as much dignity as the moment allowed them. Through all of it, Tomas stood a half step behind her with the registry satchel finally set down at his feet rather than clutched against his chest, and Petra remained at the edge of the well, no longer scanning exits with quite the same tension she had carried that morning. It was well into the evening session, the chamber's artificial lighting having taken over from the long day's dome-light hours before, when Chancellor Eventhal finally called the day's business to a close and descended from the high seat herself. An act, Soria gathered from the small ripple of surprise it caused among the marshals, that presiding chancellors did not typically perform for anyone below the rank of visiting head of state. "I owe you a private word," the chancellor said, "before this day is entirely over," and led Soria, Tomas, and Petra to a smaller chamber off the main hall, wood-paneled and quiet, with none of Concord Hall's cavernous echo. "I have presided over this body for 31 years, the chancellor said, once the door had closed. "I have seen this chamber do a great many things I was proud of, and a handful I was not. I do not think in 3 decades I have watched it come as close to its own worst instinct as it did this morning, when Proconsul Adran stood in that well and nearly talked 1,100 delegates into repeating the exact failure that put you in this position in the first place. She studied Soria for a long moment. I would like to know, honestly, how close it actually was, from where you were standing. Close enough that I spent the recess deciding what I'd tell Warden Rowe if I had to call the fleet in early, Soria said. Not close enough that I doubted the outcome by the end. Ress made sure of that before Adran ever opened his mouth a second time. She allowed herself, for the first time since the doors had opened that morning, something that was almost a genuine smile. For what it's worth, Chancellor, I don't think this body failed its own worst instinct today. I think it recognized it fast enough to correct course before the cost came due. That's not nothing. It's more than the version of this chamber that voted the sundering writ ever managed. A generous accounting. An honest one, Soria said. We didn't come back today looking for a chamber full of saints. We came back looking for one that could recognize a mistake when it saw the evidence in front of it and correct it before it repeated. You did that. Slower than I'd have liked, with one member trying very hard to stop you, but you did it. The Chancellor was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped its formal register entirely, down into something more tired and more human than Soria had heard from her all day. The young Halcrin aide who brought you the correspondence. Adran's people have already identified her. These things move fast in a building this size, whatever she hoped. Her name is Ves Odara. I intend to see her transferred, at her request, into the archivist's office, where her courage will be an asset instead of a liability, and I intend to see that no retaliation reaches her from Adran's house. I wanted you to know that before you left tonight, since I suspect you'll want to thank her yourself, and I'd rather you did it somewhere Adran's remaining allies aren't watching. Thank you, Soria said, and meant it more plainly than she had meant almost anything else she'd said that day. There is one more matter, the Chancellor said, and I raise it now rather than in open session because I think it deserves a smaller room than the one we were just in. She moved to a side console, and the wood-paneled chamber's modest display lit with a starfield, a small cluster of markers along the outer edge of the charted Concord border, well beyond the hollow reach, well beyond anywhere the day's hearing had discussed. Long-range Concord listening posts have logged 3 unconfirmed contacts along this arc in the last 2 years. Faint signatures, gone before verification, in a pattern our analysts have not been able to match to any registered species. It is not conclusive. I want to be entirely clear about that. It is not conclusive of anything. Her slate-blue eyes came up to meet Soria's. But it is the same general signature profile this Concord recorded 961 years ago, in the months before the Skarn ascendancy first appeared at our border. The room went very quiet. Soria felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the day's political theater. You're telling me they might still be out there, she said. That the thing that started all of this might not be finished. I am telling you what an honest presiding officer owes an ally she has just spent a day failing to trust properly, the Chancellor said. This Concord abandoned your species once because it feared paying the cost of defending you against that threat. I will not compound the failure by hiding from you, on your first evening back on our rolls, that the threat which justified the fear may not be entirely gone. I would rather you learn it from me, tonight, in this room, than from a listening post report 6 months from now that this body decided was not yet urgent enough to share. Soria looked at the faint markers on the display for a long moment. 3 unconfirmed contacts, a pattern too old and too familiar, a shadow that had never fully left the edge of every human decision made in the Hollow Reach for 9 centuries, even when nobody in the continuance said its name aloud. Then we'd better make sure this Concord doesn't have to choose alone this time, she said. That's the whole point of reinstatement, Chancellor, not so we can go back to being ghosts you feel guilty about. So that the next time something comes for the border arc, there's a fleet on your rolls that already knows the shape of that particular fear and isn't planning to run from it. We didn't come home to be mourned twice. For the second time that day, something crossed Chancellor Eventhal's face that was not quite hope, but stood close enough beside it to matter. "Then let us hope," she said, "that neither of us has to find out how soon." Marshal Doran Vec found Soria alone in the atrium an hour later, the wood-paneled chamber's small revelation still sitting heavy in her chest, and fell into step beside her without asking permission the way he had, over the course of one long day, stopped needing to ask for. "I ran security details for 11 chancellors before this one," he said, without preamble, watching the last of the day's departing delegates cross the marble ahead of them. "I've stood post through 3 border incidents, one attempted coup by a house that decided it didn't like an election result, and a hostage negotiation that lasted 4 days. I want you to know that as context when I tell you that today was the strangest thing I've ever guarded." "Strange good or strange bad?" "Strange I haven't decided yet," Vec admitted. "I spent the morning ready to put a body between you and this chamber if it turned violent, and I spent the afternoon standing at the aisle listening to your species get handed back something we took from it, and somewhere in between I stopped being sure which version of today I was actually supposed to be guarding against." He glanced at her, crest catching the low evening light. "You never once looked at me like I was the threat, even when Adran had half this room ready to believe you might be." "You never gave me a reason to," Soria said. "That's not nothing either, Marshal. My species spent 900 years assuming every uniform we met would default to fear first and curiosity second. You didn't." "I noticed." He was quiet for a few paces, the two of them crossing the wide atrium together in the particular companionable silence of 2 professionals who had spent a difficult day on the same side of a line neither had fully trusted the other to hold. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I intend to request assignment to your delegation's security liaison post if the Chancellor's willing to approve it, not because I think you need watching. Because I think this Concord owes your people at least one officer who learned the hard way not to assume the worst of you first, and I'd rather that lesson stay close at hand instead of walking out this door and getting forgotten by the next session's business." "I'll put in a word," Soria said, and meant it, and found, walking the rest of the way to the atrium doors beside a Concord marshal who had spent the day deciding, in real time, which version of his own institution he wanted to belong to, that the day's strangest gift might not have been the reinstated seat at all, but the small, unglamorous fact of one more person choosing, deliberately, not to be afraid. 6 weeks later, the small building the Concord had allocated to Earth's newly reinstated delegation still smelled faintly of fresh sealant, and Soria had not yet found time to hang a single decoration on its bare gray walls. It sat 2 blocks from Concord Hall, in a quarter of Talvarin's capital district that had been quietly reassigned from storage use within 4 days of the vote. A speed of bureaucratic movement, Ress had told her dryly, that the Concord had not managed for any other matter in at least a century, and that she should take as a genuine, if belated, apology rather than mere efficiency. Tomas had claimed the front office and turned it, with the single-minded energy of a 19-year-old finally allowed to matter, into a working registry post, cross-referencing 961 years of Concord archive against the continuance's own records at a pace that made even Ress's scholarly eyebrows rise. Petra had quietly assumed responsibility for the building's security without asking anyone's permission to do so, which surprised no one. Warden Cashin Rowe arrived on the 5th week, in person rather than by transmission, stepping off a shuttle from the long hearth with the careful, deliberate gait of a man in his 70s, who had spent most of his adult life aboard ships built for younger backs than his, and who had insisted, over Soria's objections, on making the crossing himself rather than sending it by proxy a second time. "You could have waited for me to bring the council to you," Soria told him, in the small office that had become, without anyone officially deciding it, the delegation's meeting room. "I could have," Rowe agreed, lowering himself into the single chair, the room possessed with the air of a man who intended to make full use of it. I decided 1,000 years of being careful had earned me one trip somewhere that wasn't hiding. He studied her for a long moment, the particular assessing look he had given her since she was 19 years old and had first told him, flatly, that she intended to be the one who walked back through those doors when the time came. "You did well, Soria. Better than well. I've read the transcript 4 times. I nearly lost it twice," she said. "Once when Adran brought up the Skarn. Once when the fleet came in early and I had to explain 61 warships to a chamber that had just started trusting me." "You didn't lose it either time," Rose said. "That's the only part that matters to the people back home. They don't need to know how close it felt from inside your own head. They need to know it held." He glanced toward the window, where the late afternoon light of Talvarin's sun was falling warm across the modest room, and something old and tired and satisfied moved across his weathered face. 961 years, and we did it without firing a shot. Your grandmother used to say that was the only kind of victory worth teaching children to want. I didn't fully believe her until today. The Territorial Commission, in the weeks that followed, moved with the grinding, unglamorous patience of anybody tasked with dividing property between the aggrieved and the entrenched. And Soria spent more hours than she cared to count in hearing rooms far less dramatic than Concord Hall's main floor, negotiating settlement terms with House representatives who ranged from quietly conciliatory to openly resentful. 2 of Adran's former allies fought every clause with the tenacity of people defending something they knew, on some level, they had no honest claim to. The young matriarch who had swayed the Halcyon block's vote proved, to Soria's quiet surprise, to be one of the Commission's fiercest advocates for a settlement that left both her own people and returning human claimants with something to build on rather than something to resent. Proof, Ress observed once, that a single honest voice inside a frightened institution could do more good than an entire fleet holding station overhead. Proconsul Kessa Adran's formal censure hearing concluded in the 4th week with the loss of his house's Concord seat and a supervised transfer of administration for 6 of the 11 contested systems, a judgment the Chancellor delivered with none of the theatrical weight of the reinstatement vote, and all of the flat, procedural finality of a body that had already decided collectively that it did not wish to spend any further ceremony on the man. He did not attend the session. Soria heard, second-hand, weeks later, that he had retired to a minor estate on one of his house's remaining worlds and had not been seen in Concord society since, a small, quiet ending for a man who had nearly talked an entire chamber back into repeating its worst historical failure. And Soria found she felt very little about it either way. There was too much else that needed doing to spend much of it on him. The hardest single session of the Commission's work came in the 6th week. Over a modest agricultural world, the Concord's old charts still listed under a Halcyon House name, and the continuance's own records listed as Cresh's Landing, one of the original 11 colonies lost in the sundering. The house holding it was not Adran's. A smaller, prouder line called House Marovec, 3 generations settled, with a delegate named Torvin Yude who came to the hearing room prepared to fight for every meter of ground his grandfather had claimed as empty territory in good faith. "I do not dispute the history," Yude told the Commission panel, standing rigid at the far end of the long table from where Soria sat with the continuance's own claim documents squared in front of her. "I dispute that my grandfather's honest settlement of land this Concord itself declared abandoned should now be treated as theft simply because the original owners have resurfaced to reclaim it. My people have buried 3 generations in that soil. You are asking me to tell them their graves sit on stolen ground." "I'm not asking you to tell them anything," Soria said. "I'm asking this Commission to recognize that a claim built on an unjust writ doesn't become just because enough time passes for it to feel permanent. Your grandfather didn't steal that land, Delegate Yude. I believe that. He settled it in good faith, under a writ this body itself has since admitted was wrong. That's not the same as saying your people have no claim at all. It's saying the claim has to share a table with ours now, instead of sitting alone at the head of it. The room had gone still around them. 6 other commission members watching a confrontation neither side seemed willing to soften first, and it was Ves Odara, seated at the edge of the table in her new capacity as the archive's junior liaison, there to verify document authenticity rather than to argue policy, who broke the impasse quietly, almost apologetically, the way she had broken the far larger impasse of the reinstatement hearing months before. "Delegate Yude," she said, "may I ask what your grandfather actually told you about the world he settled, not the deed? What he told you, as a child, about the land itself?" Yude was quiet for a long moment, some of the rigidity going out of his shoulders. "That it was already good land when he arrived," he admitted finally. "Terraced, irrigated. Someone had built the bones of a farm there before he ever set foot on it, and he always wondered who, and never had an answer because the registry told him no one." "Someone did," Soria said, and did not raise her voice because she had learned, across 6 weeks of exactly this kind of grinding, unglamorous negotiation, that grief met with more grief rarely closed a distance and almost always widened it. A family named Coral farmed that valley for 40 years before the sundering. Their youngest daughter was 11 when the evacuation order came. She's 73 now, and she's asked the commission for exactly one thing in her filing, not your removal, not compensation for 400 years of use. She's asked to be allowed to visit her family's original terraces once, with her grandchildren before she's too old to make the crossing. That's the whole of it, Delegate Yude. That's what reclaiming actually looks like for most of the people whose names are on these filings, not eviction. A visit and an honest acknowledgement of what happened, and a chance to decide together what comes next. Took 2 more sessions to settle the terms, a shared stewardship agreement, joint naming rights restoring the valley's old designation alongside its newer one, a standing invitation for continuance families to resettle unclaimed terraces on the world's northern half where House Marrow Vec's own expansion had never reached. But it was, Rest told her afterward, the single settlement out of the whole commission's docket that both sides left the table calling fair rather than merely tolerable, and it became. In the months that followed, the template the commission leaned on for 4 of the remaining 10 systems. It was in the 7th week, on an ordinary morning that had started with nothing more dramatic than a dispute over water rights language in the draft settlement terms, that Marshal Vec, who had, somewhere in the last month and a half, become a fixture at the delegation's front door rather than a guard assigned to watch it, arrived without his usual measured calm. "Envoy Kell," he said, before Tomas could even announce him properly. "Chancellor Thal needs you at Concord Hall, now. It's outer terrace." Soria felt the cold, familiar stillness drop over her before he'd finished the sentence. The same stillness she had trained into herself at 14 years old. The stillness that had carried her through the sundering recording and the infiltration accusation, and 61 ships appearing over a hostile chamber. Because some part of her had known, since the moment the Chancellor showed her 3 unconfirmed contacts along a border 6 weeks ago, that this call was coming eventually. She had simply hoped for more time than 7 weeks. "What's happened?" she said, already reaching for her coat. "Long-range sensors picked up a contact at the edge of the hollow reach 4 hours ago," Vec said. "Unregistered signature. Matches the pattern the Chancellor showed you." He held the door for her, and for the first time since she had met him, standing in an aisle with a hand not quite on his weapon, his voice carried something that was not quite fear but stood very close beside it. "It's headed for Outer Terrace, Envoy, the settlement with the schoolyard. Your people there have maybe 6 hours before it arrives." Concord Hall, when Soria reached it, bore no resemblance to the ceremonial chamber she had walked into 7 weeks before. The tiers were half empty, an emergency session, called on short notice, drawing only the delegates and staff who could reach the building inside the hour. But the ones present were on their feet, clustered in tense knots around the tactical displays that had replaced the dome's usual idle star chart with a live feed from the Hollow Reach border. Chancellor Eventhal met her at the base of the well without ceremony. One contact, confirmed Skarn's signature, moving on an intercept course for Outer Terrace at a velocity that puts arrival in 5 hours and 40 minutes, she said. No preamble at all. The flat-clipped cadence of someone who had spent the last 4 hours doing nothing but planning for exactly this conversation. This body's nearest fleet asset is the 3rd Border Squadron, 11 vessels, currently 9 hours out. We cannot reach the settlement before the contact does. The Ember Line can, Soria said. 61 ships, holding at the outer marker where they've sat since the reinstatement vote. That was never an accident, Chancellor. Warden Rowe kept the fleet in position specifically because Outer Terrace was the settlement we opened to your scout, which meant it was the settlement most exposed if this exact thing happened. She was already keying her own comm as she spoke, the old discipline of 6 weeks of preparation reasserting itself instantly under pressure. They can reach the system in 90 minutes at full burn. 90 minutes against a 5-hour window, the Chancellor said. That's a fleet with time to prepare a defense, not simply react to a threat already arrived. That's the point of the fleet holding position instead of going home, Chancellor, Soria said. We didn't stay because we thought the conquered needed to be watched. We stayed because we knew exactly what was still out there past the border, and we weren't willing to bet an entire settlement on this conquered's response time, a second time in one lifetime. The comm connected, and Warden Rowe's voice came through, already brisk with the particular calm of a man who had been running crisis drills in his head since the moment 3 unconfirmed contacts first appeared on a Concord display 6 weeks earlier. I heard the alert 2 minutes after Vec found you, Soria. The Ember Line launched 4 minutes ago. We'll have full defensive posture around Outer Terrace with 90 minutes to spare before that contact arrives. A pause, and something grim entered his voice. I want it on the record. For whatever this Conquered decides to write down about today, we are not attacking anything. We are defending a settlement of 30,000 people, including the children that scout ship saw from orbit. If the Skarn vessel breaks off before engagement, we let it go. If it doesn't, we end it fast, and we end it there, not in the settlement's atmosphere. Understood, Soria said. Chancellor, I'd ask the Concord's 3rd Border Squadron redirect to support regardless of the Ember Line's timeline. 2 fleets arriving together sends a message a single fleet standing alone can't. The Chancellor did not hesitate. Marshal Vec, relay the order. Full support posture, joint operational command with the Ember Line for the duration of the engagement. She looked at Soria, and something in her ancient face had gone taut with a tension Soria recognized instantly, because she had worn the same expression herself 7 weeks before, standing in this same well waiting for a verdict she could not control. This is the first time in this Concord's history that a joint defense has been mounted alongside a species this body once abandoned to the same enemy. I would like it to go well, Envoy. For reasons that have very little to do with politics. So would I, Soria said, and for the first time in 5 hours allowed herself to feel the fear underneath the discipline, quietly, privately, for the length of exactly 1 breath, before she put it away again where it would not show on her face. Warden Rowe's people at Outer Terrace have been drilling evacuation and hardened shelter protocol since before I was born, Chancellor. This isn't the first threat that's come near a continuance settlement in 961 years. It's just the first one this Concord's been in a position to help with. The hours that followed moved with the strange, compressed unreality of every crisis Soria had ever lived through, long stretches of nothing but tactical readouts updating in silence, punctuated by sudden bursts of information that changed everything. The Ember Line reached Outer Terrace with 83 minutes to spare and took up a defensive formation around the settlement's approach corridor, close enough to the moon's habitats that the schoolyard Marshal Vec's scout had filmed weeks before was, for the first time in the continuance's history, sitting directly beneath a visible human battle fleet rather than hidden from one. The Concord's 3rd Border Squadron arrived 40 minutes later, and Soria watched, on the chamber's live feed, as 11 Concord vessels folded into formation alongside 61 Ember Line ships, with a coordination that spoke of hours of joint tactical planning conducted, in that moment, entirely over open channel between two fleet commanders who had never once trained together and were building the protocol in real time. Idris Kell's voice came through on an open relay channel 20 minutes before the contact's projected arrival, patched through to the chamber at the Chancellor's own order so that the delegates watching could hear, in real time, exactly what the decision they had just made actually protected. Outer terrace to Joint Command. Shelters are sealed, all children accounted for in calm. We ran this drill 11 times last year alone. They know the routine better than some of the adults do. A pause, faint static, the particular strained lightness of someone keeping her voice level for the benefit of 30,000 people who could hear the same channel. I can see your formation from the surface. First time in my life I've ever been glad to look up and see that many ships at once instead of afraid of it. Hold position, outer terrace, Warden Rowe answered, his voice carrying across the same relay into the hushed chamber. Nobody reaches your sky without going through us first. That was true 900 years ago in the dark, and it's true today in the light. Nothing else has changed. Soria stood at the base of the well and watched the tactical display update in silence. The 72 joint icons holding formation. The single Skarn contact closing the distance with the flat, unhurried confidence of something that had not encountered organized resistance at this border in living memory. Beside her, unnoticed by most of the chamber, Tomas had gone very still, watching the same display with the particular white-knuckled stillness of someone doing arithmetic on how many of those 30,000 people he might have met, in another year, in another version of events where the reinstatement hearing had gone differently, and there had been no fleet holding station at all. Petra's hand found his shoulder once briefly, and did not need to say anything for him to steady. The 11 minutes the Skarn vessel spent motionless at the edge of weapons range were, Soria would say afterward to anyone who asked, the longest 11 minutes of her life, longer even than the 90 seconds, the scanning frame had taken to clear her of infiltration in front of 1,100 strangers, because this time the stillness belonged to an enemy rather than a chamber, and she had no rehearsed answer that could change what it decided to do next. She thought, standing there, of the schoolyard footage from months before, of 30 small figures scattering across a clearing with no idea a single vessel's sensor sweep was, at that exact moment, deciding whether their afternoon would end in a sheltered drill or something no drill could have prepared them for. She thought of her grandmother, 6 years old at the edge of the hollow reach 961 years before, with no fleet at all standing between her and whatever came next. She let herself think all of it once fully, and then set it down, the way she had learned to set everything down since she was 14, and watched the display instead. The Skarn contact, a single vessel, larger than any Ember Line ship but alone against 72, broke off its approach at the edge of weapons range, held position for 11 long minutes while its sensors, Soria assumed, ran an assessment no Skarn commander had needed to run against a human settlement in 961 years, and then reversed course and burned hard back toward the border it had come from. No shots were fired. No lives were lost. The entire engagement from first contact to withdrawal took just under 6 hours and ended with nothing more dramatic than a single enemy vessel deciding that a schoolyard on a hollow reach moon was no longer an easy target. Chancellor Eventhal sat down heavily in the high seat when the final confirmation came through, contact withdrawing beyond sensor range. No pursuit ordered by either fleet, joint formation holding station, until Concord Relief arrived to take over the watch, and for a long moment said nothing at all, simply looked at the tactical display, with an expression Soria had not seen on her face in 7 weeks of increasingly difficult diplomacy. 961 years ago, the Chancellor said finally, this body looked at exactly that kind of threat and decided the cost of standing beside your people was too high to pay. Today it cost us nothing but 4 hours of fear, and a school full of children on Outer Terrace ate their evening meal exactly on schedule, under a sky that had a fleet in it instead of a threat. She looked at Soria, and her voice, when it came, had none of the formal Chancellor's register left in it at all. I do not know how to apologize for 961 years in a way that means anything. I only know that today, for the first time, I think this Concord finally understands what it actually cost us to try. Word of the Outer Terrace incident moved through the Concord's 41-member worlds faster than any diplomatic communique the delegation had issued in 7 weeks, and it moved, Soria noticed within days, in a shape she had not expected and could not have engineered if she'd tried. It was not the fleet numbers that spread, 61 ships, however striking, were a statistic, and statistics traveled poorly. It was the schoolyard. It was the detail, repeated in briefing after briefing across capitals Soria had never visited, that 30,000 people on a moon most of the Concord had never heard of a season earlier had eaten their evening meal on schedule while a joint fleet held the sky above them, and that nobody on that moon had needed to run for a shelter at all. 3 additional member worlds submitted formal requests to open direct trade contact, with the Ember continuance within the month. A 4th, more cautiously, inquired about the possibility of stationing an observer aboard an Ember Line vessel to study joint defense protocol. A request Warden Rowe answered personally, from the long hearth, with the dry observation that any conquered world willing to send someone to actually watch the continuance work, rather than simply vote on rumors about it, was a world worth the trouble of teaching. Ves Odara, the young Halcrin aide whose courage had cost Adran his seat, settled into Oven Ress's archive office with a speed that suggested she had been waiting her entire career for someone to finally ask her to do work that mattered, and it was her cross-referencing, 3 months into the delegation's tenure, that turned up the detail that closed the last open question of the whole affair. A supplementary ledger, buried in the same 961-year-old archive that had produced the sundering recording, showing that the original closure writs redistribution formula had been drafted, in significant part, by a junior legal aide serving the very house that would, 9 centuries later, inherit the largest share of the reallocated systems under Adran's grandfather's name. It did not change the Commission's settlement terms. The terms had already been fairly struck by then, month by patient month, hearing by hearing. But it settled, for good, any lingering argument that the old injustice had been an accident of frightened governance, rather than something quietly engineered by people positioned to benefit from it. Soria read the ledger twice, alone in the small office with the bare gray walls, and felt none of the triumph she might once have expected to feel at finally having the whole shape of it laid out clean. Mostly what she felt was tired, and mostly what she thought about was her grandmother, 4 generations back along the continuance's careful genealogies, who had been 6 years old when the Long Hearth's founding fleet first went dark at the edge of the Hollow Reach, and who had never lived to see any of this, and who had nonetheless spent every year of her long life teaching her own children, and their children after her, that the day would come, and that when it did, the continuance would need people calm enough to walk through it without flinching. "You should tell Rowe about the ledger," Tomas said, from the doorway, watching her with the careful attentiveness he had developed, over 3 months, for reading her moods before she voiced them. "He'll want to know before this Concord makes it public." "I already sent it to him," Soria said. "He said the same thing I'm thinking." "Which is?" "That it doesn't matter anymore who engineered it," she said. "Only that we're the ones who get to decide what happens next." She set the reader down and looked out the window at the ordinary evening traffic of a Concord capital that had, 3 months ago, tried to permanently erase her species from its books, and that now, in the strange, unglamorous way institutions actually change, simply treated the Earth delegation's building as one more stop on the district's daily business. There's a ceremony at Concord Hall next week, formal unveiling of the amended registry, a marker in the chamber itself. The Chancellor asked if I'd say something. Are you going to? Something short, Soria said, and something in the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but its close and patient relative. You know me. Petra appeared in the doorway behind Tomas, arms crossed, the particular stillness she carried when she had something to report that she judged worth interrupting a quiet moment for. Warden Rowe's shuttle just cleared approach control, she said. He says he's not missing this one either. Of course he isn't, Soria said, and stood and reached for her coat, because there was, as there had been every day for 3 months, more to do before the day ended than there was time left to do it in. But for the first time since the doors of Concord Hall had opened without permission on an ordinary morning that felt now like it belonged to a different lifetime, the work in front of her did not feel like survival anymore. It felt unfamiliar and startling and entirely welcome, like the ordinary difficult work of a people finally allowed to build something in the light. The chamber was full again the day of the unveiling, fuller than Soria had seen it since the morning she'd walked in uninvited, though the mood and the tears bore no resemblance to that first tense, disbelieving silence. Delegates from all 41 member worlds had returned in person rather than sending aides, filling every seat up through the highest gallery, and the low hum of conversation that filled the hall before the session opened had the easy, anticipatory register of a body that had, for once, gathered to witness something it was glad to be present for. Chancellor Thal called the session to order from the high seat, and for the first time in 3 months, Soria noted, there was no procedural coldness in the summons at all. This body convenes, the Chancellor said, not to weigh a claim or to correct a record, but to mark one permanently, and in a form this chamber's own architecture will carry long after every delegate seated here today has left this body's service. She gestured, and the great dome's holographic display, which had shown a star chart on the morning Soria first arrived, and the raw footage of the sundering vote an hour later, resolved now into something Soria had not been told to expect. A simple, unadorned rendering of the amended Concord registry, Earth's entry restored to its original alphabetical place among the founding-era member worlds, the 961-year gap in its historical record left visible rather than smoothed over. Annotated in the Concord's own formal script with a line that had clearly taken the archive committee considerable care to word correctly, registry suspended in error, restored by right, not by mercy. Beneath the display, at the base of the well where the hearth seal had rested on Soria's first morning, workers had installed, in the days before the ceremony, a low marker of dark stone, not ostentatious, not large, a simple flat plinth that would sit permanently in the floor of Concord Hall from that day forward, inscribed in both Concord standard, and beside it, in careful hand-rendered lettering that Owen Ress himself had insisted on learning from Tomas over the preceding weeks. In the written script of Earth. Archivist Ress, the Chancellor said, if you would. Ress descended to the well a final time, slower now than he had moved on that first frantic morning, and knelt, an act of visible physical effort for a man of 4 centuries, and one the chamber watched in respectful silence, to draw back the cloth covering the marker's inscription. The Concord Standard text was formal, procedural, the language of an institution documenting its own correction for the historical record. The line beneath it, in Earth's own script, was shorter, and Soria had chosen the words herself, weeks earlier, in the small office with the bare gray walls, discarding a dozen longer drafts before settling on the one that felt true rather than merely dignified. We were never gone. We were only waiting to be seen. The chamber held it in silence for a long moment, the particular silence, Soria had learned across 3 long months in this building that this body used not to signal discomfort, but to signal that something had landed with a weight worth sitting inside rather than immediately filling with more words. "Envoy Kel," the Chancellor said, "the floor if you wish it." Soria stepped forward to the well, to the exact spot where the mosaic floor changed from gray stone to black, the same spot she had stopped at on her first morning with no idea whether the next 60 seconds would end in welcome or in her own arrest, and looked out at 1,100 delegates from 41 worlds, and found that she did not, in the end, need very many words at all. 961 years ago, she said, this chamber decided my species wasn't worth the cost of saving. 3 months ago, it decided we were worth the cost of hearing. 6 weeks ago, it decided we were worth the cost of standing beside, when it mattered, against the same threat it once decided we weren't worth defending from. She let her eyes move slowly across the tiers, resting for a moment on the Chancellor, on Res, on Yethsur, on the empty seat 2 rows up where Adran had once sat and no longer did. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you the debt's paid. It isn't. It won't be for a long time yet, and I don't think this body should let itself believe otherwise just because one hearing went well. But I'll tell you what I told the Chancellor on the day this started, because it's still the truest thing I know how to say about it." She looked down at the marker, at the words she had chosen, and then back up at the room. "We didn't come back because we needed your permission to exist. We came back because we decided we were done letting one bad vote, made 1,000 years ago by people who are all long dead, stand as the last word on who we are. That vote's corrected now. What this Concord does with the next 1,000 years is a different question, and I'd rather you answer it through what you build than through what you say in this chamber today." She stepped back from the well without waiting for applause, because applause had never been the point, and the silence that followed her held for 3 full seconds before Chancellor even Thal broke it herself, rising from the high seat to strike the ceremonial gavel one final time. Not the sharp procedural rap of a vote called or a session closed, but something slower, more deliberate, the sound of an old presiding officer marking a day she intended to remember for whatever years she had left in the high seat. "So let it stand," the Chancellor said, "in stone and in the record and in whatever this body does next to earn the trust it nearly failed to deserve." Her eyes found Soria's one last time across the well, and something passed between them that had traveled a long way since the morning the doors first opened without permission. Not quite friendship, not yet, but the hard-won foundation any real friendship between strangers eventually has to be built on. "This session is adjourned." Outside, in the wide processional hall beyond Concord Hall's great doors, the afternoon light was falling in long gold bars across the marble, and Soria found Warden Rowe waiting exactly where he'd told her he would be, leaning against a pillar with the particular patience of a man who had learned, across 7 decades, that the important part of any negotiation happened after the vote, not during it. "You kept it short," he said as she reached him. "Your grandmother would have approved. She always said the day we finally got to say our piece out loud, the temptation would be to say too much of it, after keeping so much of it silent for so long." "I thought about it," Soria admitted. "There's about 400 years of things I wanted to say to that chamber. I said the part that mattered and left the rest where it belongs." "Which is?" "In what we build next," she said, "not in what we say about what was taken." Behind them, Oven Res emerged from the great doors more slowly than the last of the departing delegates, 4 black eyes blinking against the brighter outdoor light, and crossed to where they stood with something small and flat held carefully in both hands. "I have something for you, Envoy," he said. "It is not official Concord business, so I did not present it in session. I would rather it not become a matter of record at all, if it's the same to you." He held it out, a thin data plate, older even than the case that had held the hearth seal, its casing worn soft at the corners by handling that had clearly happened over a very long span of years. This is the personal journal of the junior archivist who catalogued the closure writ 921 years ago, he said. It is not part of any official record. I do not believe anyone but myself has read it in 9 centuries, because I am that archivist, and I have kept it exactly where no one else would think to look for it since the year I wrote it. He did not quite meet her eyes as he said the next part, and something in his ancient, careful voice had gone unusually unguarded. It contains, among a great deal of professional throat clearing I would ask you to be patient with, an entry recording exactly what I told you in your antechamber 3 months ago, that I helped catalog a file for a species I privately suspected this Concord had never bothered to confirm was actually dead. I would like you to have it, not as evidence, as a record kept by one person of an unease 4 centuries did not manage to talk him out of. He set it gently in her hands. I think your continuances archives should have a copy of what this Concord's conscience actually looked like, even when it wasn't loud enough to change anything. Soria closed her hand around the plate and found she did not have a short answer ready for this the way she'd had one ready for the chamber, and let the silence stand instead, because some gratitude was better shown than spoken. "Thank you, Ovan," she said finally, using his given name for the first time in 3 months of formal address, and watched something ease in the old archivist's posture at the sound of it. Ves Odara caught up to them a moment later, moving quickly through the thinning crowd of departing delegates with the particular energy of someone who had spent the morning working up the courage for a conversation she'd been putting off. "Envoy Kell," she said, a little breathless. "I wanted to say, before you leave the building, that I never expected any of this. I brought you a data chit because I couldn't stand the idea of my grandmother's world being erased a second time by the same kind of vote that erased it the first time. I didn't think about what would happen to me after. I didn't think I'd end up working in the archive, learning your written language from a 19-year-old who's better at teaching than he thinks he is." "You did the hardest part of anyone in this building that day," Soria said. "You didn't have 61 ships holding position behind you. You just had a data chit and a decision. That takes more nerve than what I did, honestly, and I'd like you to hear that from someone who was actually there to compare." Odara's mandibles worked in something that, on a Halcyon face, Soria had learned over 3 months to read as genuine pleased embarrassment. "My grandmother would have liked to have met you," she said. "She used to say the empty world we lived on had a name once. She never got to know it was Corin's Reach. That's what the settlement charter says it was called before the redistribution. I looked it up once I had access to the archive properly." She hesitated. "The Commission's draft terms include a co-settlement clause for 6 of the 11 systems. My family's applied to stay if any of your returning claimants are willing to share. I don't know if it's my place to ask you that directly." "It's exactly your place," Soria said. "That's the whole point of a co-settlement clause, Ves. Ask the Commission. I'll make sure your name doesn't get lost in the paperwork." By the time the small group finally made its way out through Concord Hall's outer atrium, the afternoon had softened into early evening, and above the wide glass sweep of the atrium's own smaller dome, visible against a sky gone gold and rose at the edges, a familiar scattering of dark shapes still held their patient formation, smaller now, most of the Ember Line having returned to standing patrol along the Hollow Reach border weeks ago. But a token squadron left in permanent orbit over the Concord capital itself, by mutual agreement, a visible marker of an alliance neither side intended to let go quiet and unnoticed the way the old promises once had. Tomas caught up to them at the atrium doors, registry satchel slung properly over one shoulder now instead of clutched to his chest, and looked up at the fleet through the glass with an expression Soria remembered wearing herself. Once, a long time ago, the first time Warden Rowe had shown her the same view from the observation deck of the Long Hearth, and told her that one day it would not have to be a secret anymore. "Feels strange," Tomas said, "seeing them up there in daylight, out loud I mean, where everyone can see." Get used to it, Soria said. That's the whole point of coming back. A year to the day after the doors of Concord Hall had opened without permission, Soria stood on the observation platform above Outer Terrace's schoolyard and watched recess happen exactly the way it had looked from a Concord scout's grainy long-range feed 12 months before. Small figures scattering and regrouping across a clearing between two low buildings, indistinguishable from this height, from any schoolyard on any settled world in the Concord. Except for the fact that this one sat beneath a sky that held, in permanent and unremarked formation, both an ember line picket and a rotating Concord border squadron, two fleets that had learned, over a year of joint drills and shared watch rotations, to read each other's tactical signals as fluently as their own. She had not planned to come back to Outer Terrace herself. The Council of Wardens had offered her a seat of her own 8 months into the delegation's tenure. The 7th seat, vacant since the founding fleet's 3rd-generation warden had died without a chosen successor, filled now, over her own initial objections, by unanimous vote of the other 6, who had informed her, with the particular blunt affection of people who had known her since she was a child memorizing a 900-year-old recording, that a continuance which had just spent a year proving it could survive being seen needed at least one warden who had actually done the seeing herself. She had accepted, eventually, on the condition that the seat came with field duties rather than a permanent post behind a desk on the long hearth. And it was that condition that had brought her to Outer Terrace on the anniversary, to walk the settlement's perimeter with its administrator and confirm, in person, that a year of exposure to the wider galaxy had not cost this small moon anything it couldn't afford to lose. They still ask about the day the strange ship hailed us, the administrator told her, a weathered woman named Idris Kell, no relation, an accident of a common continuance surname, though the coincidence had become something of a running joke between them over the years' several visits. The children, I mean, it's become a story they tell each other. The ship that came and didn't shoot and said please hold position, and then just waited until we were ready to talk to it. She watched the recess below with the particular fondness of someone who had spent 30 years responsible for exactly this ordinary noise continuing uninterrupted. I don't think they understand yet what it actually meant. That we spent 961 years teaching every generation how to disappear, and then one conquered ship hailed us politely, and it turned out disappearing wasn't going to be the only skill this generation needed to learn after all. Do you regret it? Soria asked. Being found. Idris Kell was quiet for a moment, watching the children below with an expression that held, Soria thought, the whole weight of the question honestly. I regretted it for about 4 hours, she said finally. Right up until the joint fleet held the sky during the Scarn contact, and I stood right here on this platform, and realized that for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't the only thing standing between those children and whatever came for us out of the dark. That's not nothing, Warden. That might be the whole thing actually when you get down to it. She looked at Soria sideways. Was it worth it? From where you stood in that chamber? Ask me in another 900 years, Soria said, and there was enough of a smile in it that Idris Kell laughed, short and real, the first unguarded sound either of them had made in the conversation. Ask me today, and I'll tell you it's worth it every morning nobody has to teach a 6-year-old how to keep quiet on a continuance ship because a Concord patrol might be listening. That's the metric that actually matters to me. Everything else is politics. Idris Kell nodded slowly, turning that answer over the way a person turns over something they intend to keep. My mother used to tell the story a different way, she said. She said the day would come when we'd have to choose between staying hidden and staying whole, and that no fleet, however careful, could keep teaching a child to go quiet without also teaching it to be afraid of its own voice. I didn't understand her until I watched these children stop flinching at the sound of an unfamiliar ship overhead. That took about 4 months. It felt like the longest 4 months of my life, and also the fastest. That's the part nobody in that chamber understood when they voted, Soria said. They thought the vote was about territory or precedent or fear of what we might have become out there in the dark. It was never really about any of that, not underneath. It was about whether a generation of children got to grow up not flinching. Everything else was just the paperwork it took to get there. The observation platform's comm chimed softly, and Petra's voice came through, flat and familiar and entirely unbothered by the significance of the date. Warden rose on the line from the long hearth. Says he wants to know if you're planning to make a habit of these anniversary trips, because if so, he's putting in for one of the good cabins on the shuttle next time instead of the fold-down. The observation platform's comm chimed softly, and Petra's voice came through, flat and familiar and entirely unbothered by the significance of the date. Warden rose on the line from the long hearth. Says he wants to know if you're planning to make a habit of these anniversary trips, because if so, he's putting in for one of the good cabins on the shuttle next time instead of the fold-down. Tell him yes, Soria said, and tell him he's earned the good cabin every time from now on. She stayed another hour on the platform after the call ended, alone, watching the lights shift across a schoolyard that had, 12 months ago, been the single most consequential detail in a hearing that decided whether her entire species would be permitted to exist on paper again, and found, standing there, that the thing she felt was not triumph exactly, and not relief exactly, but something steadier than either, something closer to the particular satisfaction of a debt that had finally, after 961 years, begun to be repaid in the only currency that had ever actually mattered. An ordinary afternoon, uninterrupted, under a sky that no longer needed to be hidden from. Below her, the recess bell rang, distant and small and utterly unremarkable, and 30 children filed back inside a building on a moon that had a name of its own again, in a system that belonged, once more and for good, to a species the galaxy had spent 961 years mistakenly certain it would never have to reckon with again. The final formal session of Earth's first year back on the Concord's rolls fell on a bright, unremarkable afternoon, the kind of session that would have drawn a half-empty gallery a year before and now. Soria noted from the antechamber where she waited to be called, drew a chamber filled past capacity, delegates and aides standing along the back walls where seats had run out. It was not technically about Earth at all. The Chancellor had scheduled it to hear a petition from a small, quiet delegation representing a species called the Threnvain, 3 individuals, gray-skinned and soft-spoken, whose homeworld records showed a colony fleet gone silent at the Concord's far southern border some 400 years earlier, presumed lost, quietly struck from the active registry, the way so many quiet losses had been struck from it over the centuries without anyone troubling to check the assumption twice. Soria had not asked to be present for it. Chancellor Even Thal had asked her instead, in a private note delivered a week earlier, in terms direct enough that Soria had understood immediately she was not being invited as a courtesy. They asked for you specifically, the Chancellor told her now in the antechamber before the session opened. Not for this body's mercy. For your example, their lead petitioner has apparently spent the last several months studying the transcript of your own hearing word for word, and intends, if I understand her correctly, to walk in and say considerably less of it than you did. Good, Soria said. Brevity works better in that room than anyone gives it credit for. She did not speak in the Threnvain petition. She had not been asked to, and it was not, she understood clearly, her moment to occupy. She sat instead in the gallery beside Owen Ress, and watched a small delegation she had never met walk down the same center aisle she had walked a year earlier, stop at the same line where the floor changed from gray stone to black, and deliver, in a voice pitched low and level and entirely without tremor, a claim that took under 2 minutes to state in full, and that the chamber, this time, received not with panic or disbelief, but with the settled, attentive patience of a body that had, in the span of a single year, learned what it looked like to actually listen the first time instead of the second. The Threnvin vote passed within the hour, without a single proconsul rising to demand a scan, without a single procedural delay engineered by a house with something quietly to lose. Soria watched it happen and felt, watching, the particular ache of something that was not quite grief and not quite joy but held pieces of both. The recognition that her species' long ordeal had, in the end, purchased something larger than its own restoration. A chamber that would, from this day forward, check twice before it declared anyone extinct again. "That's the part your grandmother would have wanted you to see," Ress murmured beside her, watching the same scene with 4 black eyes that had, over a year, learned to read her moods almost as well as Tomas could. "Not the seat you won back. The precedent you left standing for the next ones who come knocking on doors that were never supposed to open again." Afterward, in the wide processional hall, with the low gold light of late afternoon falling across the marble in the same long bars it had fallen a year before, Soria found Warden Rowe waiting by the same pillar, Petra a half-step behind him, Tomas trailing with a satchel that had, over a year, filled itself with the ordinary weight of a working archive, rather than the desperate cargo of a single make-or-break case. "1 year," Rowe said. "Your grandmother gave the founding fleet 100 and told them to be patient. You gave this conquered one, and it kept its word inside it. I don't know which of you had the harder job." "She built the ship," Soria said. "I just had to walk it through the door." Ahead of them, Concord Hall's great outer door stood open onto the atrium, the way they had stood open every ordinary afternoon of the past year, warded and alarmed and entirely unremarkable now. No chime. No security surge, no 1,100 delegates coming up out of their seats at the sound of them. Simply doors, opening and closing for whoever the day's business required, the way doors were supposed to work in a chamber that had finally, after 961 years, stopped being afraid of who might walk through them next. Soria walked out through them without hurrying, the way she had walked in a year before, and did not look back at the chamber behind her, because there was nothing left in it that needed her to. Above the atrium's glass, the daylight sky held its familiar scattering of dark shapes, small and patient and entirely undisguised, a fleet no longer hiding in the dark because it had finally, after 1,000 years, found a door worth being seen standing in front of. Nobody in the Concord had ever managed to write a satisfying closing line for the file on Earth. The old chancellor's tired recording had asked how long they'd last, and got no answer for 961 years. The new marker in the well of Concord Hall said only that they had been waiting to be seen, and left the rest of the sentence to whatever came next. Soria thought, walking out into the gold light with the people who had crossed the dark with her close behind, that the truest ending was simpler than either version, and did not need a chamber's permission to be spoken, or written down, or carved into any stone at all. They had never needed the galaxy to believe they still existed. They had only needed one door, opened at the right hour, to prove it couldn't be denied any longer, and now that it was open, they had no intention of ever letting it close on them again.